He threw her off a moving stagecoach, not slowed it down, not stopped and helped her out. He grabbed her by the arm, yanked open the door, and shoved her out while the wheels were still turning, her trunk tumbling after her, splitting open on the hard Arizona dirt, her sheet music scattering in every direction like white birds desperate to escape something they couldn't name. The driver didn't stop. The passengers stared out the window as it rolled away, and not one of them called out. Not one of them told the driver to pull the reins. They just watched a woman crumple into the dust of Copper Hollow, Arizona territory, in the brutal summer of 1878, and they decided it wasn't their problem. Victor Dane straightened his jacket inside the coach and didn't look back once. If that were you, lying in the dirt, watching everything you trusted drive away, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if you're new here, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. These are the kinds of tales that don't let you go easily, and I promise you, this one is going to stay with you long after it's finished. Drop a comment right now telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if something in these first few minutes already moved you, go ahead and hit that like button. It means more than you know. Now, let's go back to that dirt road. Let's go back to Eliza Marlowe. She hadn't screamed when she hit the ground. That was the first thing people who witnessed it would remember later when they talked about it in hushed voices over supper tables. They expected a scream. Women who got thrown from stagecoaches were supposed to scream. Eliza Marlowe made no sound at all. She lay still for a moment that felt longer than it was, face turned to the side, cheek pressed against the cracked Arizona earth. The heat came off the ground like something alive. Her left palm was bleeding where she'd tried to catch herself and failed. Her dress, her good traveling dress, the deep green one she'd saved 3 months to afford, was torn at the shoulder and caked with red dust. The stagecoach had already disappeared around the bend. For a few seconds, the only sound in Copper Hollow was the wind moving through the gap between the general store and the feed barn, pushing a lazy curl of dust across the empty main street. Then Eliza tried to move. Her right ankle screamed the moment she put weight on it. She pulled herself up onto her knees, then stopped there, one hand flat on the ground, breathing in shallow, careful pulls through her nose. She would not cry. She had decided that sometime in the last 200 miles, somewhere around the moment she realized Victor wasn't going to turn into the man she'd believed him to be. She had made herself a quiet, private promise, and she intended to keep it. She would not cry in the street. Around her, the scattered pages of her sheet music shifted in the hot breeze. A scale exercise fluttered under the wheel rut. A half-finished sonata she'd been composing since Philadelphia caught on a prickle of dead grass and held. She didn't look at any of it. Not yet. What she looked at were the porches. There were people on every porch on Copper Hollow's main street. She could see them clearly. A woman shelling beans who had gone very still. A man in suspenders leaning against a post with his thumbs hooked into his waistband. 2 older men at a checkerboard who had paused mid-move. A boy of about 10 stood beside a water trough and stared with his mouth slightly open. None of them moved. This was the moment Eliza Marlowe understood something about the frontier that no letter from Victor, no travel magazine, no romantic notion she'd carried from Boston had ever adequately explained. The West didn't care about you. It was not indifferent in a peaceful way. It was indifferent the way a river was indifferent. It would carry you or it would drown you, and it would not notice either way. She got her left foot flat on the ground. She tried to push herself up. Her ankle gave. She went down again, catching herself on both palms this time, and the impact sent a bolt of pain up her wrists that made her vision go briefly white at the edges. "Well," she said quietly and to no one, "that's going to be a problem." She was talking to herself. She knew it. She didn't care. Somewhere around hour 4 of riding in silence next to a man who'd stopped pretending to love her, she'd gotten into the habit of narrating small observations out loud, just to hear a voice that wasn't lying to her. She gathered herself. Tried to think practically. Her ankle was sprained, possibly worse. Her trunk was 15 feet away, sprung open, with her clothing half buried in dust and her teaching materials sliding toward a ditch. She had $4.60 in a small leather purse sewn into the lining of her underskirt. Victor had found and taken everything else. She was in a town she had never visited, knew no one in, and the nearest city with a train station was apparently 43 miles east. She cataloged these facts the way her father had taught her to catalog a problem. dispassionately first, feelings later. Get the shape of the thing. The shape of the thing was very bad. She was trying to calculate whether she could crawl to her trunk and salvage enough to present herself at whatever passed for a boarding house in this settlement when she heard boots. Deliberate boots. Not hurrying, but purposeful. The kind of walk that didn't ask anyone for permission. She looked up. The man crossing the street toward her was not young. He was somewhere in his late 30s, broad through the shoulders in a way that looked functional rather than decorative, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had been outdoors for years longer than it had been indoors. He was wearing work clothes, not Sunday clothes, not salesman clothes, the kind of worn canvas and faded cotton that meant he actually used his hands. There was a smear of something that might have been axle grease on his left forearm. He was not the kind of man Boston had prepared her to encounter. He stopped about 6 feet away from her, didn't rush the last few steps, didn't immediately crouch down and start patting her hand and asking if she was all right the way men sometimes did with hurt women, performing concern for an audience. He just looked at her for a moment, assessing, the way you'd assess a situation before deciding how to handle it. "Can you stand?" he asked. Not "are you okay?" Not "what happened?" Not "let me help you, little lady." "Can you stand?" "I was working on that," Eliza said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, more like a recalibration. "Your ankle." "Right one. I don't think it's broken." She paused. "I've never broken a bone, so I don't actually know what that feels like, but it seems like it would feel worse than this." "It does," he said. "Feel worse." "Then probably just sprained." He nodded once, like they'd settled something. Then he moved to her right side, crouched, and without any preamble offered her his left arm to use as a brace. No speech about it. No asking permission for 3 additional sentences first. He just made himself available and waited. Eliza looked at the arm. She looked at the man. She thought about the $4.60 sewn into her skirt. She took the arm. He lifted her without grunting, which she appreciated more than she would have expected. She got her left foot under her, kept the right one off the ground, and found herself standing, mostly, in the dust of Copper Hollow's main street, holding on to the forearm of a complete stranger. "I'm Eliza Marlowe," she said, because it seemed important to establish that she was a person with a name, not simply a problem to be managed. "Rourke Callahan," he said. "Mr. Callahan." She glanced toward her spilled trunk and did the mental arithmetic of how to get there and how to close it. "I can manage from Doc Aldridge's 3 buildings down," Rourke said, already moving, already making it very clear that she wasn't, in fact, going to manage from here without assistance. "You can tell me to go to hell after he looks at your ankle." Eliza opened her mouth, closed it. "That's fair," she said. The people on the porches watched them go. Not one of them had moved. Not one of them had crossed the street. Later, a few of them would feel some private version of shame about that, the kind you don't examine too closely. But in that moment, they just watched Rourke Callahan escort a battered stranger down the street, the woman's green dress torn at the shoulder, her dark hair half fallen from its pins, her jaw set at an angle that suggested she was in more pain than she intended anyone to see. The boy by the water trough stared until they disappeared into Doc Aldridge's doorway. Then he quietly went and collected Eliza's sheet music from the dirt. He stacked it carefully, pages he couldn't read, music for an instrument he'd never heard, and carried it to her trunk. He folded it as best he could and placed it on top of her things. Then he closed the lid as far as it would close, which was not very far, and sat on it to keep it from flying open. Nobody told him to do that. He just did it. Copper Hollow was not, entirely, without its graces. Doc Aldridge was 71 years old and had been practicing medicine in the Arizona Territory since before it had that name. His office smelled like camphor and old paper and something else Eliza couldn't identify that she decided not to think about too hard. He had a white mustache, large enough to qualify as its own weather system, and hands that moved with the practiced certainty of a man who had seen everything twice. He examined her ankle without comment, which she appreciated. He cleaned and dressed her palms with the efficiency of someone who did not believe in making injuries more dramatic than they already were, which she also appreciated. What she did not appreciate was what he said when he was done. "You'll need to stay off this for a week, minimum. 2, if you have sense." He set her foot down gently. "You got somewhere to stay?" Eliza was quiet for a beat too long. The doctor's eyebrows went up, just barely. He glanced toward the doorway where Rourke Callahan was standing with his arms crossed, not quite in the room, but not outside of it either, occupying the threshold the way he seemed to occupy most spaces, taking up exactly as much room as was useful without any extra. "There's no boarding house," Eliza said. It wasn't a question. She'd seen the layout of the street. "Mrs. Garland takes in travelers sometimes," Doc said, "but she's full up through September, railroad workers." He paused. "There's Harkins, but I wouldn't recommend it to a woman alone." "What's wrong with Harkins?" "It's a saloon." "I see." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up. Eliza could hear it moving through the gap under the door, bringing the smell of hot dust and something faintly like sage. She thought about the $4.60. She thought about 43 miles. She thought about Victor Dane straightening his jacket and not looking back. She did not cry. She was very proud of herself for that. Rourke spoke from the doorway. "The guest room at Iron Creek is empty. Has been since March." Eliza turned to look at him. "I'll stay in the bunkhouse," he said, in the flat tone of a man who was making a practical statement, not an offer to be negotiated with. "You can have the house. Take your time with the ankle. When you're ready to figure out what you want to do next, you'll figure it out from a chair instead of a ditch." "You don't know me," Eliza said. "No," he agreed. "I might be a terrible person." His expression didn't change. Terrible people don't usually announce it. Criminals sometimes do, to throw you off. "Are you a criminal?" "I'm a music teacher from Boston," she said. Rourke looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I'll get your trunk," and walked out. Doc Aldridge made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He capped his camphor jar. "Best offer you're likely to get in Copper Hollow, Miss Marlowe." Eliza looked at the door Rourke had just walked through. She looked at her bandaged hands, pale against the brown of the doctor's exam table. She thought about what it meant to accept help from a stranger, about what it cost, about what it obligated you to. Then she thought about lying in the dirt while everyone watched from their porches. "Yes," she said quietly, "I expect it is." The ride to Iron Creek Ranch was 11 miles, and Rourke drove the buckboard in silence. Not the uncomfortable kind of silence that needed filling, the kind of silence that had shape to it, that told you something about the person sitting in it. Eliza had grown up in a house full of noise, her mother's piano, her father's students arguing philosophy in the parlor, 3 brothers who treated volume as a civic virtue. She had spent 27 years believing that quiet people were either bored or hiding something. She was beginning to revise that opinion. The land they drove through was not beautiful in any way she had language for yet. It would take her months to develop the vocabulary for Arizona's particular kind of beauty. The way the light changed everything. The way the distance was so large it changed the scale of you. Right now it just looked harsh and vast and slightly threatening. The mountains purple and remote at the horizon, the brush along the road scrubby and determined looking, like it had survived by deciding not to have any preference about conditions. She watched it go by. "What happened to your wife?" she asked. She felt Rourke's hands shift slightly on the reins. Not a flinch, just a small movement. "Doc talks too much," he said. "He didn't say anything. I saw the ring line." He glanced at her. His right hand, she'd noticed when he helped her, had a faint pale stripe across the ring finger. Not recent, years old. He looked back at the road. 3 years ago," he said. "Fever. The baby too." Eliza said nothing for a moment. The buckboard wheels found a rut and bumped through it. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it without decoration. He nodded once. They didn't speak again for the rest of the drive, but the silence was different after that. It had more weight to it, more honesty. 2 people who had each lost something sitting in the same small space, not pretending otherwise. When they turned off the main road and she saw Iron Creek Ranch for the first time, the long, low house, the big red barn, the cottonwoods along the creek bed, the ranch hands moving between the outbuildings in the long, late afternoon light, she felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. She felt like there might be a next thing, not a good thing necessarily, not an easy thing, just a next thing. She hadn't been sure, lying in the dust of Copper Hollow's main street, that there was going to be one. Rourke pulled the buckboard up in front of the house and set the brake and climbed down without ceremony. He lifted her trunk from the back. Then he came around to her side, looked up at her and held out his hand. Careful on the step, he said. Don't put weight on the right. She put her hand in his and stepped down carefully, one-footed, graceless. Mr. Callahan, she said when she was on the ground. Yeah. What you did today? She looked up at him directly. Crossing the street. Not everyone would have. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite read. Not embarrassment, not modesty. More like he was weighing something. No, he said. They wouldn't. He picked up her trunk and carried it inside. Eliza stood in the yard of Iron Creek Ranch with her bandaged hands hanging at her sides and her ruined dress and her sprained ankle and her $4.60 and the very strange, very fragile, very new feeling that maybe the West had not entirely decided to kill her. Not today, anyway. She followed him inside. The first night at Iron Creek, Eliza didn't sleep. Not because the room was uncomfortable. It wasn't. The bed was real, with an actual mattress, which was more than she'd had at the boarding house in Tucson, where she and Victor had stopped 3 weeks ago, where the mattress had been a folded wool blanket over a rope frame that left marks on her back. This mattress had springs. The pillow smelled like cedar and old lavender, the kind of smell that meant someone had cared about a room once, even if they weren't caring about it anymore. She lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to Iron Creek Ranch settle into itself. The creak of the roof in the wind, a horse moving in the barn, the distant sound of a coyote doing something philosophical 3 hills over. Normal sounds. Safe sounds, probably. She didn't feel safe. She didn't feel unsafe either. That was the strange part. She felt like a person who had been running so hard for so long that now that she'd stopped, her body didn't know what to do with stillness. Her heart was still going at the pace of a woman in trouble. Her mind was still cataloging exits. She thought about Victor. She tried not to, but she did, the way you press on a bruise even when you know it's going to hurt. Some compulsion toward the pain that doesn't have a clean explanation. She went back to the beginning, the way she had 100 times in the last 3 weeks. The concert hall in Boston where she'd met him. The flowers he sent afterward, yellow roses, which she'd thought was charming, and which, in retrospect, meant he'd paid attention to what she mentioned liking and then deployed that information strategically. The 3 months of courtship, so perfect, it should have made her suspicious. Her mother had been suspicious. Her mother had used the word performance once, at Sunday dinner, and Eliza had been so angry she'd left the table. Her mother had been right. That was the worst part. She wasn't angry at herself exactly. She'd been through that in the coach, going west, sitting next to a man who'd stopped pretending. She'd sat with the anger at herself, examined it, turned it over. She understood how it happened. Victor Dane was very good at being whatever a room needed him to be, and what Eliza had needed at 27 was someone who made her feel like her life was large enough. She'd been teaching piano to other people's children for 4 years. She loved it, and it wasn't enough. Victor had looked at her and said, without ever using those words, "You deserve more than this." And she had believed him because she'd wanted to believe him, which was not the same as being stupid, but was, perhaps, the same as being human. She let that thought settle. She was not stupid. She was here, wasn't she? In a real bed with cedar and lavender pillows, with $4.60 and 2 bandaged hands and a sprained ankle and no particular plan, but alive and intact and not going to spend 1 more mile sitting next to Victor Dane in a stagecoach. That was something. She fell asleep somewhere around 3 in the morning, thinking about the piano. Well, she'd seen it when Rourke showed her to her room. Visible through the open door of the main parlor, a dark upright against the far wall, older than anything else in the house. She hadn't said anything about it. She hadn't trusted herself to say anything about it, actually, because it had been long enough since she'd played that the sight of any piano produced a feeling close to grief. Victor hadn't allowed it toward the end. Not in so many words. He didn't have to. He had a way of sighing when she played, like the music was something he was generously tolerating, and gradually she had played less, and then rarely, and then not at all. And she had told herself this was a reasonable adjustment, a compromise, the kind of thing adults did. She understood now that what she had actually done was disappear herself, piece by piece, to make more room for him. The piano was just the most obvious piece. She was thinking about the next morning, sitting at the kitchen table with her ankle wrapped and propped on a second chair, when one of the ranch hands knocked on the doorframe and came in to put a pot of coffee on the stove. His name was Denny, he told her, when she introduced herself. He was about 19, with sunburned ears and a serious expression that looked like it was working very hard. "Mr. Callahan says to tell you breakfast is whatever you can find, and he'll be back from the east pasture by noon." "He didn't have to leave instructions," Eliza said. Denny looked uncertain. "He did say it like it wasn't instructions, ma'am. He said it like he was just saying it." Eliza looked at the boy. "How long have you worked for him?" 3 years. "Is he always like that?" Denny thought about it with his whole face. "Like what?" "Economical." Another pause. "I don't know what that means exactly." "Like he's measuring out words and doesn't want to waste any." Denny relaxed a little, like she'd named something he'd been trying to put a label on for 3 years. "Yes, ma'am, always." He poured her coffee, told her the eggs were in the cold box in the pantry if she wanted them, and went back outside. Eliza sat with her coffee and watched the morning come through the kitchen window. The hard, bright Arizona light that had no interest in being gentle, and thought about a man who drove 11 miles in silence and meant it as a kindness. She found the eggs. She also found, on the second shelf of the pantry, a half-eaten jar of peach preserves and a loaf of bread going slightly stale. She made herself toast over the stove, standing on one foot with one hand braced on the counter, which was more complicated than it had any right to be, and which she absolutely did not ask for help with, because Denny was right outside the window and she refused to call out to a 19-year-old because she couldn't manage toast. She managed the toast. She ate at the kitchen table and watched a red-tailed hawk circle something in the field beyond the barn, patient and remote, and tried to think about what came next. The problem was she didn't know enough about Copper Hollow to know what was possible. She knew she needed income. She knew her ankle would ground her for at least a week, which meant she had a week to gather information before she could act on any of it. She knew she had skills that were worth something. She was an excellent teacher. She could keep books. She could manage a correspondence. She could play piano well enough that it had been her primary income for 4 years in Boston. What she didn't know was whether any of those things had a market in a frontier settlement of what appeared to be 300 people and a great deal of dust. When Rourke came back at noon, she asked him about it directly. He'd come in through the back door, hat in hand, trail dust on his shoulders, and a small cut on his chin that she decided not to comment on. He poured himself water from the pitcher on the counter and drank half of it standing up. "What's in Copper Hollow?" she asked. He looked at her. "For work," she said. "What does the town need that isn't there?" He set the glass down. Appeared to be running a genuine mental inventory, which she appreciated. General store, feed store, blacksmith, dock, 2 saloons, Harkins and one that's more like a hotel, if you squint at it right. Church without a regular minister, stage depot. "School?" "No." She looked at him. "No school." "No school," he confirmed. "Closest one's in Maricopa Wells, 30 miles. How many children in town?" "Families with children." He thought about it. 11, 12 families. Maybe 30, 40 children of school age. Eliza set her coffee cup down. "Is there a building?" she asked. "Empty, unused, anything with a roof and 4 walls. There's the old Morrison building at the end of the main street. Morrison pulled out 2 years ago when the silver played out. It's been sitting empty." "Is it structurally sound?" Rourke looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize. Not quite amusement, not quite surprise. Something between them. Like he was recalibrating again. "I'd have to look at it," he said. "Would you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yeah, I'd look at it." "Thank you," she said. He picked up his hat, which he'd set on the table, turned it once in his hands, a habit she'd noticed. "You move fast," he said, "for someone with a sprained ankle." "The ankle is a temporary condition," Eliza said. "The other things aren't." He left. She heard him go back across the yard, heard him say something to Denny in a low voice, heard Denny laugh at whatever it was. She sat with her coffee and looked at the window and thought, a school. It was not a small thought. It opened up into something bigger the more she turned it over. Not just a job, not just income, but something she could actually build. Something that couldn't be taken away the way Victor had taken her savings, because you couldn't steal a town's trust once you genuinely earned it. You couldn't pocket a community and ride off with it in a stagecoach. She thought about 30 or 40 children 30 miles from the nearest classroom, and something tightened in her chest that wasn't grief and wasn't fear. It was the other thing. The thing she'd almost forgotten about herself. She wanted to do it. The ankle took 9 days to behave, which was longer than she'd estimated and shorter than Doc Aldrich had predicted. She spent the first 3 days at the ranch mostly stationary, which was approximately 3 days longer than was comfortable for her, and she suspected at least 1 day longer than it was comfortable for Rourke, who seemed to run his household on the assumption that everyone in it was mobile and purposeful at all times. He didn't say that. He would never have said that. But she could feel the shape of the ranch's daily rhythm, and she was a snag in it, and she didn't like being a snag. On the 4th day, she started helping with things she could do sitting down. She mended a pile of work shirts she found in a basket near the fireplace. She organized a chaos of receipts and feed invoices she found on the desk in the small office off the hallway, which had apparently been functioning as an architectural suggestion rather than an actual system. She found a ledger in the bottom drawer that hadn't been touched in 8 months, and she reconciled it to the loose receipts. And when Rourke came in that evening and saw what she'd done, he stood in the doorway of the office for a long moment without saying anything. "I wasn't prying," she said, because the silence had gone on long enough. "I found them on the desk. I'm an organized person. It's a compulsion." "The last column," he said. She looked at where he was looking. "You've been overcharged by your grain supplier for at least 6 months. I'd have to go back further to know exactly how much, but it's significant. Whoever was keeping your books before wasn't checking the invoices against the delivery receipts." Rourke's jaw worked once. "It's Beals?" she asked. "Yeah." "Talk to him. Show him the ledger. He may not know. If he has a new clerk, it could be an error rather than deliberate." Rourke looked at her. "And if it's not an error?" "Then you have documentation," she said. "Either way, you have documentation now." He picked up the ledger, looked at her neat columns, her corrected figures, her small notations in the margin where she'd flagged discrepancies. She had good handwriting, precise and clear, the handwriting of someone who'd spent years writing on chalkboards. "Thank you," he said. "It gave me something to do," she said. "Sitting still makes me irritable." "I noticed," he said. She looked up sharply. There was something almost there in his face, the beginning of something. He suppressed it, but not quite fast enough. "Good night, Miss Marlowe," he said, and took the ledger and left. Eliza stared at the empty doorway for a moment. Then she looked back at the desk, at the neat receipts, at the work she'd done, and she felt something complicated and not entirely unwelcome move through her chest. She did not examine it, not tonight. There were enough things to examine. On day 5, she discovered the piano. Or rather, she'd known it was there. She'd been aware of it every day, the way you're aware of a word you're deliberately not saying. She walked past the parlor door twice a day on her way to and from the kitchen, and every time she didn't look at it, which was itself a kind of looking. That evening, Rourke had ridden into town on business. The ranch hands were in the bunkhouse. Denny had left a lamp burning in the kitchen like he was leaving a light on for her, which she found touching in a way she didn't show because Denny already had a slight tendency to hover and she didn't want to encourage it. She stood outside the parlor doorway for probably 2 full minutes. Then she went in. The piano was old, older than it had looked from the doorway. It was a Steinway upright from at least the 1850s, and it had been through something. The cabinet was scarred on the left side from what might have been a cross-country journey or might have been a significant accident, and 2 of the ivory key covers were missing, leaving the bare wood of the keys underneath. She ran her hand along the top, collected a serious quantity of dust, and looked at her palm. She sat down on the bench. The bench wobbled. One of the legs was slightly shorter than the others, and she shifted her weight until she found the stable point. She put her bandaged hands on the keys, pressed middle C. The note that came back was sharp. Not terribly, but noticeably. The whole instrument probably needed tuning and had needed it for a long time. She played a scale. Slow, 2 octaves, both hands. Several more keys were flat or sharp. The sustain pedal stuck slightly on the way up. She played the scale again. And then, without planning to, without deciding to, she started playing. It was one of her own compositions. Not a formal piece, not something she'd finished, just a thing she'd been building in her head for the last 2 years. 2 years in the scraps of time. Victor hadn't managed to fill with his requirements and his moods. She'd never played it out loud. It existed only in her head, in the small hours, in the gap between what she'd wanted her life to be and what it had become. It sounded different out loud. Bigger. More complicated. The out-of-tune notes caught in some places in a way that was almost interesting, that gave the piece a roughness she hadn't planned and didn't hate. She played for a long time. She lost track of it. That was the thing about playing. It was the only activity she'd ever found where time did something different, where an hour could feel like 10 minutes, and also like something complete in itself. Even with the imperfect tuning, even with the wobbling bench and the missing ivory and the dust. She didn't hear Rourke come back. She didn't hear him stop in the hallway. She found out later from Denny, who had seen the light on in the parlor from the bunkhouse and come to investigate, and who had found Rourke standing just outside the parlor doorway in the dark hallway, listening, not wanting to interrupt, just standing there. Denny hadn't interrupted either. When she finally stopped, stopping not because she'd decided to, but because her hands had run out of what they knew how to do with the piece she hadn't finished, the house was completely quiet. She sat for a moment. "That was yours," said Rourke's voice from the hallway. She turned on the wobbly bench. I was standing in the doorway, hat still on, which meant he hadn't been back long or hadn't thought to take it off. His expression was something she hadn't seen on him yet, not guarded, not assessing. Open, in a way she suspected cost him something. "It's not finished," she said. It sounded finished. "It's not. There's a whole third section I haven't worked out yet." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That was my mother's piano." She hadn't known that. She felt the weight of that information settle onto her, onto the room, onto the piece she'd just played through an instrument a dead woman had loved. "I should have asked," she said, "before I played it. I'm sorry." "No." He came into the room, came into it properly, not standing at the threshold. He pulled the chair that was angled near the fireplace and sat down in it, which surprised her. He didn't seem like a man who sat in parlors. She would have liked that. She would have liked someone using it. When did she? 68. Yellow fever, same year as my father. He said it flat, the way you said things you'd had years to make flat. "I kept the piano because I couldn't figure out what else to do with it. Can't play it myself, couldn't sell it, so it just sat." Eliza looked at the piano, at the scarred cabinet, the missing ivories, the keys still warm under her fingers. "It needs tuning," she said. "I know. I can do that, actually. I used to tune my own piano in Boston. I'll need a tuning hammer. I can check if your toolbox has one, or—" "Eliza." She stopped. He almost never said her first name. He'd been careful about it, formal in the way frontier men were formal with women they were trying to respect. The sound of it was different than she expected. Not soft, not sweet, just direct. Like everything else about him. "You don't have to earn your keep," he said. "The books? The piano? You're not a hired hand. You're a guest. Stop trying to pay for everything." She looked at him. "I'm not paying," she said after a moment. "I'm doing things because they need to be done and I can do them. That's different." He considered that. "Is it?" "Yes. One is about debt. The other is about usefulness. I need to be useful. It's—" She stopped. Started again more carefully. "I've spent the last 2 years making myself smaller and smaller so another person could have more room, and I don't want to do that anymore, but I also don't want to sit in a chair doing nothing while someone provides for me. I'm not built for it." The room was quiet. The lamp on the mantelpiece threw a soft, practical light. Outside, something moved in the yard. One of the horses, probably. "All right," Rourke said. "All right? You're useful. I get it. Stop apologizing for it." She blinked. "I wasn't apologizing. You were explaining yourself. It's close enough." She looked at him for a moment. "You're not easy to talk to, Mr. Callahan." "No," he agreed. "I've been told." "Who told you?" "My wife," he said. "Frequently." She hadn't expected him to say that. From the slight shift in his expression, she didn't think he'd expected to say it either. It landed in the room between them, and neither of them moved for a second, and then Rourke stood up and picked up his hat from where he'd set it on his knee. "The Morrison Building," he said, returning to solid ground. "I looked at it yesterday. The roof has 2 bad sections on the east side, but the structure's sound. You'd need glass for 2 windows. The rest is cosmetic." She stood up from the piano bench, put weight on her ankle. It held mostly. "Could it be repaired?" "I can repair it." "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to." There was something almost dry in his voice. "You're not the only one who does things because they need doing." She looked at him. He looked back at her. They were both standing in the parlor of a ranch house in the Arizona Territory at 9 o'clock at night, in a situation that had no good category in any book of manners Eliza had ever been taught from, and somehow neither of them seemed particularly confused about it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, put his hat on, left. Eliza stood in the parlor alone for a moment, her hands still carrying the memory of the piano keys, the room still holding the sound of a piece she hadn't finished. She thought about his mother. She thought about a piano sitting in an empty room for years because someone couldn't figure out what to do with love they had nowhere to put. She thought she understood that. She sat back down on the wobbling bench and played the first section again, quietly, for the room. She moved into Copper Hollow on the 11th day. Her ankle wasn't fully right. She had a slight hitch in her step that Doc Aldridge said would probably resolve in another 2 weeks, and might always give her a little trouble in cold weather. Welcome to the territory. But it held her weight reliably, and she was done waiting. Rourke drove her into town himself. He didn't offer to. He simply appeared with the buckboard at 8 in the morning, which she'd learned to recognize as his method. He didn't ask. He just made himself available and let her decide. She'd decided to take the teacher's cottage that stood 20 yards from the Morrison building. It was small, one room with a sleeping alcove, a cast-iron stove, and a porch facing east. But it was hers, and that word, hers, had a weight to it she hadn't felt in 2 years. She'd arranged for it through a letter she'd written 6 days ago and had Denny carry into town, along with 3 other letters. One to the Territorial Education Board, one to the parents of school-aged children she'd identified through Rourke and Doc Aldridge's combined knowledge of the settlement, and one to a school supply company in Tucson. The letters had worked. Not immediately, not without friction, but they'd worked. By the time she arrived in Copper Hollow on day 11, 3 families had already promised their children would attend. The wife of the feed store owner had organized a collection of books from every household that had them. The blacksmith, a large, slow-speaking man named Arguello, who had 3 daughters under 10, had asked if he could repair any furniture she needed moved into the schoolhouse, and she had said yes before he finished the sentence. The Morrison building still had 2 bad roof sections, a floor that needed sweeping in a serious and committed way, and no furniture to speak of. What it also had, as of the morning, Eliza walked in and stood in the middle of its empty floor and looked up at the smoke-stained ceiling and the pale Arizona light coming through 2 clean windows that had been installed sometime in the last 6 days, were 2 clean windows, installed by someone who hadn't signed his work. She stood there and looked at those windows for a long moment. Then she turned around. Rourke was in the doorway, leaning against the frame, arms crossed, looking at the roof sections he'd repaired. "The glass is even," she said. "It should be. The frames are new wood. Old frames were rotted." She looked at him. He looked at the roof. "Rourke," she said. He looked at her. "This community needs this school," she said. "But I need you to know, this is mine, what I'm building here. I'm not building it for you or because of you. I'm building it because I can and because it needs to exist. I want that to be clear between us." Something moved across his face, something that looked like respect but deeper than the surface kind. The kind that comes from recognizing yourself in someone else's stubbornness. "It's clear," he said. "Good. For the record," he said, "I patched the roof and replaced the windows because the building needed it. Not because I wanted claim to what you're doing with it." She held his gaze. "I know that." "Okay. Okay." The wind moved through the building, fresh and sharp, through the new windows. The floor was already less dusty than it had been. Someone had swept it recently, maybe yesterday. She looked at the expanse of it, thought about desks and slates and 30 or 40 children, thought about the piece she hadn't finished, and Victor Dane and the long road from Boston. Then she thought, start here, start now. This is what next looks like. She set her bag down on the floor of what was going to be her schoolroom and started making a list. The first person to give her trouble was a rancher named Cutter Briggs. He came to the cottage 3 days after she'd moved in, on a Tuesday morning when she was on the porch repairing a broken chair leg she'd found in the schoolroom. He was about 50, weathered in the specific way of men who'd spent decades outside and decided to be angry about it, with a mustache waxed to points that she felt said something significant about his character. He stood at the bottom of her porch steps without being invited up. "You're the teacher," he said. "I am," she said, and kept working on the chair leg. My boy's 8. I'm not sending him to a school run by a woman who got pitched off a stagecoach. She looked up from the chair leg. There was a version of herself, the version from 2 years ago that had been slowly smoothed down by Victor's disapproval, that might have apologized, might have said something conciliatory, might have tried to make this man comfortable at the expense of her own dignity. Your son's education has nothing to do with how I arrived in this town, she said. My qualifications are my degree from Boston Normal School, 4 years of private teaching, and the full endorsement of the Arizona Territorial Education Board, which you're welcome to write to and verify. If your concern is actually about your son's education, I'd be glad to discuss it. If your concern is about what the stagecoach situation makes people think about you by association, that's a different conversation and not one I'm having. Cutter Briggs stared at her. She went back to the chair leg. There was a long silence. She heard him shift his weight on the steps. What times are you running? He said finally. 8 until noon, Monday through Friday. Afternoon sessions for older students twice weekly. Another silence. My boy is good with numbers, he said. Not so good with reading. Most children his age are one or the other, she said. That's what school is for. Cutter Briggs did not apologize. She did not expect him to. He turned and walked away down the street, and she watched him go and then looked at the chair leg and felt something fierce and clean in her chest. She had not come west looking to be approved of. She had come west to build something. The approval could come afterward, or not at all, and either way she intended to have something to show for having been here. On the morning of the day before the school was supposed to open, with 34 enrolled students and a freshly swept floor and a set of borrowed readers arranged on a shelf Arguello had built and installed without being asked, Eliza sat on the steps of the Morrison building in the long September light and let herself feel, just for a moment, the full distance between the woman lying in the dust of Copper Hollow's main street and the woman sitting here now. It wasn't a comfortable distance. It was the kind of distance that had things in it you didn't want to look at too long. But it was real, and it was hers, and it went in the right direction. She was still sitting there when Rourke rode in from the direction of Iron Creek, saw her on the steps, and pulled up his horse. He looked at the building. He looked at her. Tomorrow, she said. Ready? She thought about it honestly. For the children, yes. For whatever else comes, probably not. But probably doesn't matter. He nodded. He sat on the horse for a moment without moving, the late afternoon light long across the street, and she had the specific feeling, not for the first time, of being seen by someone who wasn't trying to rearrange what they saw into something more convenient. I'll be in town tomorrow, he said. If you need anything. I probably won't. I know, he said. I'll be here anyway. He rode on toward the livery stable, and she watched him go, and she did not examine the feeling that produced because there was still too much to do before morning. But she noted it, the way you note something you intend to come back to. Filed it away somewhere behind the enrollment list and the chalk inventory and the broken chair she'd fixed and the plan for the first day's lessons. She went back inside to finish preparing. The school would open in the morning. She had decided that. Nothing else had been decided yet. The morning of the first day, Eliza woke at 5. She hadn't said anything to wake her. Her body just did it, the way it had always done before something that mattered. Recitals, examinations, the first day of each new teaching term in Boston. Some internal mechanism that didn't care whether you were ready and got you up anyway. She dressed carefully. Not the green traveling dress, which was repaired but still carried the particular shame of the dust of Copper Hollow's main street in its fibers somewhere, no matter how well Mrs. Garland's girl had cleaned it. She wore her second best, a dark blue wool that was slightly too warm for September in Arizona, but carried itself with authority, and authority was what she needed this morning more than comfort. She braided her hair without a mirror, which she'd gotten good at in the cottage, whose single small mirror was positioned at a height, suggesting it had been installed by someone considerably shorter than she was. She made coffee. She drank it standing at the stove because she was too restless to sit. Then she walked to the schoolhouse at 6:30 in the morning, 2 hours before the students were supposed to arrive, because she needed to stand in the empty room alone before it became something else. The September light was already coming hard through the east-facing windows, Rourke's windows, the ones he hadn't signed, turning the swept floor a pale gold and making the room look more finished than it was. The donated books were on Arguello's shelf. The borrowed slates were stacked beside them. She'd written the alphabet across the top of the chalkboard 2 days ago in her clearest hand, uppercase and lowercase, and under it the numbers 1 through 20, and it was still there, unmolested, which she'd half expected not to be true because she'd been having dreams where she arrived to find the building vandalized. It was not vandalized. It was, in fact, almost peaceful. She walked the length of it slowly, touched the edge of the chalkboard, straightened a row of desks that were already straight, stood at the window and looked out at Copper Hollow's main street in the early morning before it had woken up to itself, when it was just buildings and light and the distant sound of someone's rooster making its daily argument with the world. She thought about her students. She had 34 enrolled, ranging in age from 6 to 14, which was going to present its own challenges. 14-year-olds and 6-year-olds needed different things, and she was one person in one room. She'd taught mixed age groups before, briefly, in a rural county outside of Boston where a school had needed a substitute for 3 months. She knew how to do it. It was harder than it sounded and more interesting than it sounded, and she was, despite everything, genuinely looking forward to it. She was not looking forward to the parents. The parents were a variable she could not entirely control, and she'd been doing this long enough to know that the parents were almost always more complicated than the children. She thought about Cutter Briggs. He hadn't sent a confirmation that his boy would attend. She'd mentally put him in the possible column rather than the probable one and moved on. You couldn't spend energy on the ones who weren't coming. You spent it on the ones who were. She was at the chalkboard, adding a simple arithmetic problem she'd decided to put up as something for the early arrivers to look at, when she heard the door. She turned, expecting one of the Arguello girls. The oldest, Paloma, had asked if she could come early to help. But it wasn't Paloma. It was a boy she didn't recognize, maybe 9 years old, with a too large hat he'd pushed back on his head, and a look on his face that was attempting to be casual and achieving the opposite. He stopped just inside the door like he hadn't fully committed to being here yet, and might need to reverse the decision quickly. "School doesn't start until 8, Eliza said. "I know," said the boy. "You're early." "I know that too." She looked at him. "I was wearing boots that were slightly too big, the kind passed down from an older sibling, and he had ink stains on his right hand that suggested either a recent education or a recent accident with a pen. "What's your name?" she asked. "Thomas Briggs," he said. She kept her expression exactly where it was. "Cutter Briggs is your father." "Yes, ma'am." "He enrolled you?" The boy's chin moved up about 1/4 of an inch. "He didn't say I couldn't come." That was not the same thing, and they both knew it. "All right, Thomas Briggs," she said, and turned back to the chalkboard. "Since you're here, can you tell me what 24 divided by 6 is?" A pause. She heard him take 2 more steps into the room. "4, he said. "That's easy." "Good. What about 36 divided by 9? "4 again." Another step. "These are all going to be 4, aren't they?" "For now," she said. She wrote a new problem. "What about this one?" She heard him come further into the room, drawn in despite himself, the way children always were when something was slightly more interesting than they'd expected. By the time she turned around, he was 3 desks deep into the room, hat in his hands now, looking at the board with the particular focus of a child who is good with numbers and knows it. "This," she thought, "is why I'm here. Not Cutter Briggs and his waxed mustache and his opinions about stagecoaches. This 9-year-old with ink-stained hands standing 3 desks deep in a room he'd walked into before his father gave him permission, because his brain wanted something this room had. "Sit anywhere you like," she said. Thomas Briggs sat in the second row, center desk, like he'd already done the math on optimal positioning. He put his hat under the chair. He looked at the board. "It's 7, he said. "The last one." "Show me how you got there," she said, and handed him a piece of chalk. By 8 o'clock, she had 29 students, not 34. 29. 5 families had sent apologies through neighbors, a sick child, a farm emergency, one family who had apparently reconsidered overnight and not sent word at all. She noted it and set it aside. 29 was plenty. 29 was honestly more than she'd let herself fully expect, and the room was loud with the particular noise of children who'd been brought together in a contained space for the first time, which is a specific kind of noise that resembles chaos but is actually closer to electricity. All that potential before it finds a direction. She let it run for exactly 3 minutes. Then she walked to the front of the room, stood behind the teacher's desk she'd inherited from somewhere. It was an old thing, heavily scarred with one drawer that stuck, and said, in the voice she'd developed over 4 years that carried without shouting, "Good morning." The room didn't go quiet immediately. It took 2 repetitions and 1 well-timed pause. But it went quiet. 29 faces looked at her. This was the moment she'd always loved, even when she didn't love everything else about teaching. This precise moment, before any of it had happened yet, before anyone had struggled or succeeded or been embarrassed or surprised, when every face was just open and waiting and you could do anything with it. "My name is Miss Marlowe," she said. "I came here from Boston, Massachusetts, which is roughly 2,000 miles that direction." She pointed east. "Some of you may have heard that I arrived in Copper Hollow in a somewhat undignified manner." A few of the older children exchanged glances. "That's true," she said. "I also once fell off a piano bench in front of an audience of 200 people, misspelled necessary on a chalkboard in front of 37 students, and burned 3 batches of rolls so thoroughly that my neighbor in Boston began referring to me as the smoke woman." She paused. "What I'm telling you is that people make mistakes and still manage to be useful. That's more or less what school is for." So, she picked up the chalk. "Let's begin." The morning went, as first mornings always did, imperfectly. A 6-year-old in the first row cried twice and then fell asleep, which was her preferred solution to distress and not without logic. 2 of the older boys, 13 and 14, had clearly decided in advance to be difficult and spent the first hour doing quiet things they thought she couldn't see. She could see them. She let it go for the moment, made note, planned a different approach. What she hadn't planned for was Paloma Arguello. Paloma was 11, the blacksmith's eldest, and she was sharp in a way that some teachers found threatening and Eliza found immediately interesting. She'd been educated sporadically, a year with a traveling tutor, some months at a school in Tucson when her family had lived there briefly. And there were gaps in what she knew that sat alongside things she knew better than most adults. Within the first hour, Eliza had quietly moved her from the general reading group to working with the older students. And Paloma had accepted this without comment, but with a slight straightening of posture that said everything. By noon, when she released the younger children and sent the older ones to lunch, Eliza felt like she'd been running uphill for 4 hours and had arrived somewhere worth being. She sat at the scarred teacher's desk and ate the biscuit she'd brought from the cottage. She hadn't had time to make anything more elaborate. And made notes in the margin of her enrollment ledger. Not really notes, more a map of the room. Who was where? Who needed what? The 2 difficult older boys, well, their names were Harlan and Pete, were bored, she'd decided. Not bad. Bored. Bored students became difficult students when nobody gave them something hard enough to do. She'd give them something hard enough to do tomorrow. She was still writing when she heard the sound from outside. It was a horse, moving too fast for town speed. Then it stopped. Then she heard voices, low, male, the particular register of men who were choosing their words carefully in front of other men. She went to the window. The man on the horse was not someone she recognized immediately. He had his back to her, talking to 2 of the men from the hardware store who'd stepped out onto the walk. He was tall in the saddle, dark-coated despite the heat, with a quality of stillness that was different from the stillness of a man at rest. It was the stillness of a man who was watching everything and showing nothing. Then he turned his head slightly, and she saw his profile. The biscuit she'd been holding dropped onto the desk. She didn't move for approximately 5 seconds. Her body did what bodies do when they recognize something they'd rather not. It went very still, and her breathing got careful and shallow, and the room around her did that thing where it became very precise at the edges. Every detail too clear. Victor Dane was in Copper Hollow. He hadn't left her behind. He'd tracked her forward. She didn't go to the window again. She stepped back from it, out of sightline, and stood with her back against the interior wall beside the window frame and thought, fast and hard, about what she knew. He had found her. That meant he'd been asking. Victor was very good at asking questions in ways that got answers. He was charming when he needed to be, and he knew how to present himself as the worried party, the concerned man searching for his poor lost fiancé. She could reconstruct exactly how that had sounded. She'd heard that voice. She'd believed that voice once. She thought about what she had, which was 29 students expected back in the afternoon, A school she'd worked for 2 weeks to make real. A sprained ankle that was nearly right but not completely, and no weapon of any kind. She thought about what he had, which was approximately 6 feet of calculated charm and a willingness to use everything behind it when the charm ran out. She was not afraid. She did a quick, honest inventory. She was angry. Under the anger was something older and colder, which was the knowledge that she knew exactly how this went. She'd watched it go exactly this way before, and she was not going to stand against a wall in her own schoolhouse and wait for it to come to her. She straightened up, smoothed her dark blue wool, and went out the front door. Victor was still in the street. He'd dismounted now. He was talking to Ben Harlow from the stage depot with an expression of such genuine-seeming pleasantness that she almost recognized the man she'd thought she was engaged to. He was good at this. She wanted to remember that. He was very, very good at this. He saw her. The pleasantness shifted into something warmer, something that was engineered to look like relief. "Eliza," he said. He took a step toward her. "Thank God. Stop there," she said. He stopped. His expression recalibrated. She watched it do it, the small mechanical adjustment behind the eyes, and she thought, "I see you now. I can see exactly how it works." "You're angry," he said. "I'm working," she said. "This is my school. Those are my students' lunches being eaten right now, and they'll be back in approximately 20 minutes, and you are not going to be here when they return." Ben Harlow from the stage depot had gone very still in that particular way of someone who has found himself in the middle of something he didn't plan to be in the middle of and is calculating his exit. "Eliza, let me explain. You put me off a moving stagecoach," she said. "Not a stopped one, a moving one, while the wheels were still turning." She said it clearly, and she said it at a volume that Ben Harlow and anyone else in earshot could hear without straining. "You stole my savings. You abandoned me in a town I'd never been to, injured, with $4.60. I don't need an explanation. I need you to leave." Victor's pleasant face was gone now. What was under it was the face she'd seen in the last 3 weeks of the journey west, the one that came out when nobody useful was watching. It was a sharper face, harder around the jaw. "You're my fiancé," he said. "I was your fiancé. That relationship ended when you threw me into the dirt. You don't have the right to just—" "I have every right." Her voice was steady. She was interested to discover how steady it was. "I am telling you to leave Copper Hollow. Whatever you came back here to retrieve, it isn't here." He looked at her. She could see him doing the math, the same way he always did the math. What could he use? What leverage did he have? Which angle was weakest? He'd been doing this math on her for 2 years, and she'd let him because she hadn't known that's what the pauses were. She knew now. "You have nothing," he said. It wasn't shouted. It was said quietly, almost gently, the way you said things you intended to go deep. A schoolroom in the middle of nowhere. One dress. No family within 2,000 miles. You think this is a life? "Yes," she said. "I do." "You'll change your mind." "I won't." "Eliza?" "Miss Marlowe," said Rourke Callahan's voice. She hadn't heard him come up. She hadn't known he was in town, hadn't seen him since the day before. He was there now, having come from the direction of the livery stable. And he wasn't running, wasn't rushing, just walking with that particular unhurried walk that somehow covered ground faster than it should. He stopped beside her, slightly forward, which she noted without being entirely sure how she felt about it. He looked at Victor. Victor looked at him. Men were like this sometimes, she'd observed. They did a kind of rapid, silent assessment that was almost like animals measuring each other. Size, bearing, what the hands were doing, what the eyes were doing. Victor did this assessment on Rourke, and whatever he concluded from it, the slight shift in his posture said he didn't entirely like the answer. "This isn't your business," Victor said. "Miss Marlowe has asked you to leave," Rourke said. "In Copper Hollow, that's enough." "On whose authority?" "Mine, at the moment," Rourke said. "And about 15 other people who are going to have an opinion on a man who throws a woman off a stagecoach and then comes back looking for her." Victor's jaw worked. He looked at Eliza. The expression on his face was something she recognized from the last months of their time together. The one that appeared when a room wasn't going his way, and he was deciding whether to make a scene or withdraw and try a different approach later. He was calculating whether a scene was worth it. He decided it wasn't. "This isn't finished," he said to her. "Yes," she said, "it is." He turned to his horse, mounted with a deliberateness that was meant to look unhurried and looked, instead, exactly like what it was, a man choosing the retreat that preserved the most dignity. He rode out the south end of the main street at a controlled pace. Eliza watched him go. She stood in the street in her dark blue wool with her heart doing something complicated in her chest and her hands very still at her sides, because she was not going to let her hands shake in the main street of Copper Hollow, where Ben Harlow from the stage depot and at least 3 other people were watching. "He'll come back," she said. "Probably," Rourke said. "I know how he is. One reversal isn't enough. He'll find a different approach." Rourke was quiet for a moment. "You all right?" "I'm fine." "You don't have to be fine immediately." She turned and looked at him. He was still watching the south end of the street where the dust of Victor's horse was settling, and there was something careful in his profile. Not anger exactly, but the thing that was adjacent to it in a man who kept a tight rein on himself. Controlled heat. "My students are coming back in 15 minutes, she said. He nodded. "I have to go in and finish preparing the afternoon lesson." "All right." "Rourke." He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for being there, but I had it." "I know you did," he said. It was said simply, without qualification, and she believed him. She went back inside. She stood at her desk for exactly 2 minutes, allowing herself those 2 minutes privately, in the empty room. She put both hands flat on the scarred surface and breathed. Her hands were shaking slightly, which was fine. They were allowed to shake in private. She let them. Then she picked up her chalk, turned to the board, wrote the afternoon's first lesson heading in her clear, clean script. When the first of the afternoon students came through the door, she was standing at the board with her back straight and her voice ready. Thomas Briggs came back. She hadn't been certain he would. She was glad he did. Victor Dane did not leave Copper Hollow. This was what Rourke told her 2 mornings later, when he came by the cottage before school. She'd known it, in the way you know things you don't have evidence for yet. A feeling under the skin, a heightened alertness when she walked to the schoolhouse, a habit she'd developed of noting who was on the main street and where. "He's staying at Harkin's," Rourke said. He was on her porch, hat in hand. He didn't come inside uninvited, ever. It was a consistency she'd noticed and respected. "He's been talking to people, telling a version of what happened." "What version?" "That you had an argument, that you left of your own accord, that he's here to reconcile." She absorbed this. "How many people believe him?" Rourke was honest. "Some." She nodded slowly. "Because he's more familiar than I am. He looks like what they expect a man to look like, and I look like what came off the stagecoach." She didn't say this bitterly. She said it the way she catalogued problems, dispassionately first. "The families with children at the school believe you," Rourke said. "That's something." She thought, "He's going to try to come to the school. That's the next thing. He'll try to come while the children are there, because a public scene with children present is complicated for me, and not for him. He can play the concerned man in front of witnesses, and I look hysterical if I react." Rourke looked at her steadily. "What do you want to do?" "I want to teach school," she said. "That's what I want to do. Everything else is what I'm going to have to manage around it." He was quiet for a moment. "I can have someone near the building." "Not obviously." "Not obviously," he agreed. She looked at him. "You're not sleeping much, are you?" He blinked. "What?" "You have the look of someone who's been up before 4 for several days running. My father got that look when he was worried about something he couldn't control directly." Rourke put his hat on. "I'll have Denny near the street side." "Rourke." He looked at her. "I'm not your wife," she said. Not unkindly. "You don't owe me your sleep." The air between them shifted in some small way that neither of them moved to address. "I know that," he said. His voice was even. "Denny will be at the street side." He went down the porch steps. She watched him go, and she thought about what she'd said and whether she'd meant it the way it came out, and decided it was too complex a question to look at directly this morning. She had school to run, and a man she'd once trusted circling the edges of everything she'd built, one problem at a time. Victor came to the school on Thursday. Not during school hours, she'd half expected that, had prepared for it, had even mentioned to Paloma Arguello, the eldest and the sharpest, that if any adult man she didn't recognize came to the door during lessons, Paloma was to go immediately to find Arguello Sr. at the blacksmith's. Paloma had not asked questions, which was one of approximately 17 things Eliza already admired about her. Victor came after hours at 4:30, when she was alone in the room erasing the day's work from the chalkboard and resetting it for tomorrow. She heard the door and said without turning, "I'm closing up. Please come back in the—" She turned. He closed the door behind him. There was a version of this she'd been through in her head multiple times since Monday. She'd played it out different ways. In some versions, she was eloquent. In most of the realistic ones, she was less eloquent and more direct, which was actually more useful. "You need to leave this building," she said. "I want to talk," Victor said. He had his reasonable voice on, the lower register, the one that said, "I'm being very patient with a difficult situation. 5 minutes, that's all. I have nothing to say to you that I haven't already said. I know you're angry." He moved into the room. Not fast. Casual, like they were two acquaintances having a conversation. "And you have a right to be. What I did was, I was not at my best. I know that. I've been thinking about it, and I know that." She kept the teacher's desk between them and kept her voice level. "You threw me off a moving vehicle. I didn't throw... You grabbed my arm and shoved me out the door while the wheels were turning. What word would you prefer?" His jaw tightened. The reasonable voice developed a harder edge underneath it. "You were screaming. I was arguing," she said. "I was telling you that you had stolen my money and you didn't want to have that conversation, so you removed me from the situation. That's what happened. We both know that's what happened." "Eliza, what do you actually want?" she said. "Not the version you've been telling people at Harkins. What do you actually want from being here?" He looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, the performing stopped, and she saw the actual calculation underneath it. It was not pretty, and it was not complicated. Victor Dane was a man who did not like to lose things he'd decided were his, not because he valued them for what they were, but because losing them reflected poorly on him. She understood this now with a clarity she hadn't had in Boston, surrounded by his yellow roses and his well-chosen words. "I want you to come back," he said. "No. I can make this right. There's nothing to make right. There's nothing to return to." She held his gaze. "I'm not angry, Victor. I was. I'm past it. What I am now is finished, and the two things aren't the same." He crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed her arm. Not hard enough to bruise, immediately. That would come if she pulled away, she knew from experience, but hard enough to hold. The grip of a man who'd learned that the first physical assertion established the terms of what followed. She did not pull away. She looked at his hand on her arm. She looked at his face. "Take your hand off me," she said. The voice she used was not the teaching voice. It was quieter, more precise. "Just listen." The door opened. It wasn't Denny. It was Rourke Callahan, and unlike both times before, he was not moving with his usual deliberate, unhurried quality. He was moving with the specific speed of a man who had come through a door having already decided what needed to happen, and what needed to happen happened fast. Victor's grip on her arm was broken, and Victor himself was 2 steps back from her with Rourke between them before she'd fully processed the sequence. Victor's hand went to his hip, where a holster was. Later, she would think about the 2 seconds that followed as one of those intervals that expand. She saw Rourke see the hand going to the hip. She saw him make the assessment, the same rapid, silent one she'd watched him do in the street, but this time not silent, not slow. His own hand moved. She didn't look at what his hand did. She looked at Victor's face. Victor's face went through several things quickly. The gun in his hand never got above waist height. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space. Victor went down, not dead. She registered that immediately, before she registered anything else. He went down with his left hand clutching his right shoulder, and the revolver hit the floor 2 feet from him. The echo died. Rourke was still standing. He lowered his gun without ceremony. He looked at Victor on the floor, then at Eliza. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The question was so practical, so immediate, that it broke through the ringing in her ears better than anything else could have. "No," she said. She looked at Victor on the floor of her schoolroom. He was breathing. His face had gone the gray-white of shock and pain, and his hand was pressed to his shoulder and blood was seeping between his fingers. And he was looking at Rourke with an expression that was equal parts hatred and the specific terror of a man who has just discovered he has entirely miscalculated a situation. "Get up," Rourke said, not loudly. "You can stand. Shoulder won't stop that." Victor got up slowly, because Rourke was right. It was a bad wound, but not a killing one. "You're going to ride out of Copper Hollow tonight," Rourke said. "Before you do, I'll have Doc Aldridge look at that. After, you don't come back, you don't write, you don't send anyone. If I hear your name in this territory again, we'll have a different conversation." Victor's breathing was ragged. He looked at Eliza. She looked back at him. There was nothing left she needed to say to him, and she found, examining herself honestly in that moment, that she had nothing left she wanted to say to him. Whatever residue of feeling she'd been carrying, the grief, the anger, the recurring bewildered question of how she'd been so wrong, it had all been settled in that grip on her arm. In the moment when he'd grabbed her in a room she had built and thought that was a thing he could still do. He couldn't. "Go with him," she said to Rourke. "I'll be all right." Rourke looked at her for a moment, that assessing look, reading whatever he read in her face. "I'll send Denny." "I'll send Denny," he said again, quietly, and she understood he wasn't sending Denny because he thought she needed protecting. He was sending Denny because he didn't want her to be alone in a room where a gun had just gone off and expect to feel nothing about it. She nodded. He got Victor to the door. At the threshold, Victor turned and looked back at her one more time. She was already at the chalkboard. She picked up the eraser and finished what she'd started. The town knew by morning. In Copper Hollow, in 1878, trying to keep a gunshot private was an exercise in optimism. Sound traveled, and people were interested, and by the time Denny had sat with her for an hour, and she'd sent him home and made herself supper and slept badly, and gotten up at 5 again, the shape of what had happened had moved through the settlement like water finding level. She was prepared for it to go badly. For the version that said Rourke had shot a man over a woman, for the version that said there was something scandalous in Eliza's relationship with a cattle rancher that had produced this violence, for the version Victor had been cultivating all week about the reasonable man trying to recover his unreasonable fiancé. What she was not prepared for was what actually happened. Mrs. Harlowe, Ben's wife, was on the steps of the schoolhouse at 7:30 with a jar of apple butter and the information that she'd heard the entire Main Street altercation on Monday and had told 6 people Victor's version of events was a considerable reinterpretation of observable reality. Arguello arrived at 8 with both of his eldest daughters, and the information that if Miss Marlowe needed anything at all, he would consider it a personal favor to help. Cutter Briggs arrived at 8:15. He arrived alone, without Thomas, which told her the conversation was for her, not a drop-off. He stood at the bottom of the steps again with his waxed mustache and his leather-hard face, and he looked at her for a moment before he said anything. "I heard what happened," he said. "Yes," she said. "Callahan did right." She looked at him. "Man puts his hands on a woman in her own place of work," Cutter said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't expected, something rough-edged and old. "That's not something Copper Hollow needs to tolerate, regardless of the circumstances." There was a story there, she thought, something old and specific that had given him an opinion about this particular thing. She didn't ask. "Thomas is coming today?" she said. Cutter Briggs looked at the schoolhouse, at the roof, at the windows. "He'll be here at 8, he said, "and he'll be here every day you're open." He left. She stood on the steps of her school in the early September light, with the jar of apple butter in her hands and 34 students on their way. And she thought about the woman who'd lain in the dust of this street 11 days ago and watched everyone on every porch and understood that the West didn't care about you. She revised that. The West was complicated about caring. It had its own terms and its own timeline, and it expressed itself sideways rather than directly. But it was not entirely indifferent. At 8 o'clock, 34 students filed through the door of Copper Hollow's school. Not 34. She counted again. 36. 2 children she hadn't seen before, siblings, with a note from their mother. They'd heard there was a school now. They were asking if there was room. They couldn't pay much, but their father had timber and was willing to do work on the building in exchange. Eliza put the note in her desk drawer. She went to the board. She thought about Rourke, who was probably at Iron Creek by now, probably in the east pasture with his jaw set and his hands doing what they needed to do, who had stood in a doorway and moved when it mattered, and then asked, immediately, if she was hurt. Not whether he'd done the right thing. Not what it meant. Just, "Are you hurt?" She thought about a piano that needed tuning and a piece she hadn't finished. She thought about a man who made promises simply, in plain language, without decoration, and appeared to mean them exactly as stated. She wrote the first problem on the board. "Good morning," she said. And 36 voices said it back to her, and the school that was hers, that she had built and fought for and refused to abandon, filled up with noise that was not chaos but was, precisely, potential. She turned back to the board. There was work to do. Victor Dane left Copper Hollow on a Thursday night with Doc Aldridge's bandaging on his shoulder and nothing else he'd come for. Eliza knew this because Denny told her Friday morning, having apparently made it his personal responsibility to track the information and deliver it, which she suspected Rourke had quietly arranged. She didn't ask. She accepted the information the same way she'd accepted the apple butter from Mrs. Harlowe, as a thing offered in good faith that she would be ungracious to refuse. She went to school. This was, she was discovering, her answer to most things. Not in an avoidant way, not in the way of a person burying themselves in work to avoid feeling the work's edges. More in the way of a person who had found the thing that organized the rest of their life and kept returning to it as a point of reference. When she wasn't certain about something, she went to school. The school was certain. The school needed her to be specific and present and forward-looking, and those were the conditions under which she functioned best. The Friday after Victor left, she had 38 students. 2 more families had sent children with notes, both mentioning they'd heard the school was good, both slightly formal in the way of people who weren't sure of their welcome and were testing the water carefully. She wrote back the same day, welcoming both children by name, noting what grade she'd placed them in based on what their parents had described, asking if either family had books at home they might be willing to loan to the school library. Library was a generous word for 6 shelves of donated volumes, but it was a real word and she intended it to remain a real word. What she did not do, in the 2 weeks after Victor's departure, was go out to Iron Creek. This was not accidental. She was aware of it the way you're aware of a room you're deliberately not entering. The same way she'd been aware of the piano that first week. She knew why she was doing it. Rourke had shot a man for her, not for her precisely. He would resist that framing, and she would grant that he'd resist it for real reasons, not false modesty. He'd shot a man because a man had drawn a weapon in a room where Eliza was standing, and Rourke was the kind of man who responded to that in that particular way, and the outcome of his response was that Victor Dane was gone, and she was teaching school. But the fact remained that something had happened in that schoolroom, and that something had a shape she wasn't entirely ready to look at squarely, and she'd learned enough about herself in the last months to know that when she wasn't ready to look at something squarely, the right response was to wait until she was, rather than to look at it sideways and mistake the angle for the truth. So she taught school. She also, in the evenings, worked on the piano piece. She'd moved the composition forward by 2 sections since she'd first played it on Rourke's mother's instrument. She worked on it at the cottage, on a borrowed lap desk with manuscript paper Denny had ridden to Tucson to get for her. She hadn't asked him to. He'd simply appeared with it one afternoon and said, "Mr. Callahan thought she might need it." And she had looked at the manuscript paper for a moment and felt something press warmly against her sternum that she decided was gratitude and nothing further. The 3rd section of the piece was giving her trouble. It wasn't a technical problem. Technically, she knew exactly what she wanted. A specific kind of return to the opening theme, altered, carrying the weight of everything that had come between the first statement and this one. What she couldn't get right was the transition into it. The piece kept wanting to arrive at the return too cleanly, too resolved, and that wasn't true to what she was writing about, which was, she had to be honest with herself about this, sitting at the cottage at 9 in the evening with the lamp burning low. The piece was about the distance between who you were and who you were still becoming. It was about being in the middle of a thing and not knowing its shape yet because you were inside it. You couldn't write a clean transition into that. It had to be a little uncertain, a little unresolved. She worked on it until 11 most nights. On the 3rd Friday after Victor left, Rourke came to town. She saw him from the classroom window at noon, when she was eating her lunch and watching the street with the particular unfocused gaze of someone whose brain was still half in what it had been doing. He was at the hardware store across the street, coming out with two young ranch hands she didn't recognize, all three of them carrying something. She watched him without meaning to, the way you watch a fixed point without choosing to fix on it. He looked up. She looked away from the window. She ate the rest of her lunch with her eyes on the enrollment ledger, which had notes that needed updating, and which needed her attention, and which she gave her full attention to for the remaining 8 minutes of her lunch break. He came to the cottage that evening. She was on the porch with her manuscript paper and a pencil when she heard his horse, and she didn't look up immediately. She gave herself a moment, made a note in the margin of the measure she was working on, and then looked up. He was at the gate, hat in hand again, which she'd noticed was what he did when he was uncertain about his reception. Not that he'd ever admit that was the reason. "Come in," she said. He came up the path and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked at the manuscript paper without asking about it. "You've been avoiding Iron Creek," he said. She appreciated that. No preamble, no softening, just the thing. "Yes," she said. "All right." He turned his hat once in his hands. "Anything I did?" "No," she said. "Then because that wasn't quite accurate enough. Not the way you mean." He waited. This was one of the things about him. He waited without filling the space, without getting uncomfortable, and reaching for something to say. Most people she knew, the silence would have broken them before it broke her. With Rourke, she genuinely wasn't sure. He might simply wait forever, patient as the mountains at his back. "You shot someone," she said. "In my schoolroom." "Yes." I'm not criticizing it. He drew first and you were faster and he's alive and gone and the school is still standing. I know what happened and I know how it came out. But the fact of it is still... She stopped, tried again. "Something happened in that room, and I've been trying to figure out what it means, and I needed some time without being near you to think about it clearly." He looked at her. Whatever he was thinking, his face was doing its usual excellent job of keeping the specifics private. "Have you figured it out?" he said. "Mostly," she said. "And?" She set the manuscript paper on the porch rail and gave him her full attention. "I care about you," she said. "I think you know that. I think I've known it for a while, and I've been careful about it because the last person I cared about in that particular way turned out to be using a version of me he'd invented. And I'm not entirely certain I can trust my own judgment on this subject yet." Rourke was very still. "I'm not him," he said. "I know that." She said it without hesitation, because she did know it. It was one of the clearest things she knew. "That's not what I'm uncertain about. I'm uncertain about myself. About whether I'm ready. About whether I'm attaching to you because you lifted me off the ground when no one else would, or whether I'm attaching to you because of who you actually are. Those are different things." "Are they?" he said. "Or are they both part of how people come to know each other?" She looked at him. I don't say things like that usually," he said, and he sounded slightly uncomfortable with himself, which she found more reassuring than the words themselves. It's a real question. I don't know that the beginning of how you know someone isn't part of knowing them." "That might be true," she said. "Give me some time to be sure." He looked at her for a long moment. "How much time?" "A month," she said. He nodded once. "I won't disappear," he said. "I'll be in town. I'll be around. He stopped, put his hat on. "I won't push." "I know," she said. He went back down the path. At the gate, he stopped without turning. "The manuscript paper," he said. "Denny said you'd been working on something." "The third section," she said. "I've been trying to get the transition right." He was quiet for a moment. "Does it have to be right?" he said. "Or does it just have to be honest?" She stared at his back. He opened the gate and went to his horse and rode out without looking back, and she sat on the porch with the manuscript paper in her lap and thought about that for a very long time. October came in hard, the way Arizona autumn could. Not cold exactly, not what she'd have called cold from a Boston perspective, but with a quality of sharpness in the morning air that said the summer had withdrawn and intended to stay withdrawn. The light changed. It came in lower and longer, and what it did to the land around Copper Hollow was, she was finally developing the vocabulary for beautiful in a way that required patience before it revealed itself. The school had 41 students. She'd needed to reorganize 3 times as children arrived, adjusting her groupings, recalibrating her schedule. She'd also identified a problem she should have anticipated and hadn't. Four of her oldest students, 13 and 14, were embarrassed to be in the same classroom as 6-year-olds. It had started as a dignity issue and threatened to become a discipline issue. She solved it by giving the 3 oldest students a job. She called it apprentice teaching, which was a thing she'd mostly invented and which she gave the name to with enough confidence that it sounded established. Paloma Arguello was the obvious choice and had taken to it immediately, working with the youngest readers in a corner of the room, while Eliza handled mathematics and composition with the middle group. Harlan, one of the 2 boys who'd been difficult in the first week, turned out to have a talent for explaining arithmetic that none of his other qualities had predicted. He was patient with younger children in a way he wasn't patient with anyone his own age, and he explained things in plain language that cut right to the problem, and the 6- and 7-year-olds he worked with made progress that surprised her. She told him so on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of October, when the younger students had gone and the older ones were finishing independent work. He looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. "I wasn't doing anything special," he said. "You were explaining the carrying method in subtraction to a 7-year-old who'd been stuck on it for a week," she said. "She got it. That's not nothing." He looked at the top of his desk. "My little sister couldn't add when she started school," he said. "I taught her. It took me all summer." "You're good at it," Eliza said. "That's worth knowing about yourself." He didn't respond. 14-year-old boys in 1878, she'd learned, had very limited bandwidth for compliments they didn't know how to refuse or return, and the right response was to let it land and move on before the embarrassment curdled into defensiveness. She moved on. She was writing the week's progress notes that evening when she heard the knock at the cottage door, and when she opened it, she found Paloma Arguello standing on the porch alone, which was unusual because Paloma did not come to the cottage alone, and it was after dark and she was 11 years old. "What's wrong?" Eliza said immediately. "Nothing's wrong," Paloma said. "I wanted to ask you something." Eliza stood back and let her in. "Does your father know you're here?" "I told him I was coming to ask Miss Marlowe something. He said, 'Be back by 8. She sat in the chair nearest the stove without being invited, with the comfortable directness of a child who'd assessed that this was not a formal household. "I want to learn more than what you're teaching in school." Eliza looked at her. "I can tell when we've reached the edge of what you're covering for my level," Paloma said. "You move on when you know I've gotten something, but I want more of the things you're not covering yet, such as literature, real literature, not the readers, and geography past the territory, and more mathematics than carrying and borrowing. Those are things that take time to teach well." "I know." Paloma looked at her with the absolute directness she always used, which was one of the things that made her simultaneously an excellent apprentice teacher and occasionally an exhausting presence. "I have time. I get up at 5. I could come at 5:30. Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she said. Not as a challenge, genuinely. Paloma thought about it, which was something Eliza appreciated. She didn't answer reflexively. "My father is a good man," she said. "He works hard. He's proud of his work. But when I'm his age, I don't want to be here." She said it without apology. "I want to be somewhere where the things in my head have more room, and the only way to get there from here is through school." Eliza set her pen down. She thought about a girl in Boston, not so different in the architecture of her ambition. A girl who'd been told, frequently and in various genteel ways, that the things in her head had natural limits that coincided helpfully with the limits society had already arranged for women. A girl who'd become a music teacher because it was the most adjacent career to the one she actually wanted, which was to be a composer, which was a thing women were not, as a category, supposed to be. 5:30, Eliza said. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We start with algebra and work outward. Agreed? Paloma smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't happen often and landed with full force when it did. Agreed, she said. She was gone by 7:40, which was inside her father's deadline. Eliza sat for a while after she left, not writing, thinking about what it meant to teach a child who already knew she was going somewhere, what it meant to be the person who showed her the road. She picked up the manuscript paper, looked at the third section, looked at the transition she'd been fighting for weeks. She thought about what Rourke had said. Does it have to be right, or does it just have to be honest? She picked up her pencil and wrote 4 measures that were not what she'd planned, that were uncertain and a little rough, and didn't resolve the way she'd intended, and that were, she recognized when she read them back, Exactly true. She wrote the rest of the section in 45 minutes without stopping. The month Eliza had asked for lasted 31 days. On the 31st day, a Saturday in early November, she woke at 5 as usual, lay in bed for a few minutes thinking about what she was going to do, decided she knew what she was going to do, and got up. She made coffee. She put on her coat. It was genuinely cold now in the mornings, the kind of cold that meant it, and sat on the porch with the coffee until the sun was up enough to make the ride reasonable. Then she saddled the horse she'd been borrowing from Arguello. She'd been learning to ride over the past month, badly and with considerable stubbornness, because she'd decided it was a necessary skill and had refused to let the difficulty of it be a reason not to. And she rode out to Iron Creek. It was not a graceful ride. It was 11 miles on a horse she was still negotiating a relationship with, in cold that made her fingers clumsy on the reins, on a road she knew by buckboard, but not by saddle. She got there at 7:30, which was about 20 minutes longer than it should have taken, and she was considerably less elegant in the dismount than she intended. Rourke was at the fence line south of the barn when she rode in. She saw him see her, saw him go still for a moment in the way he went still when something surprised him, which was not a long stillness, just a breath's worth. Then he came across the yard. "You're riding," he said. "Badly," she said. "But yes." He looked at her, not at the horse, at her. "It's been a month," she said. "I know. I've been thinking." "I know that too." She looked at him standing in his yard in the early November light, in his work clothes, with the particular quality of attention he gave her. That she'd learned over these months was not something he gave casually or frequently. That most people who knew Rourke Callahan were aware of his capability and his reliability and his general decency, but were not on the receiving end of that specific attention, which operated differently from the general version. "I'm not going to become something smaller," she said. "The school stays mine, the music stays mine. Whatever I'm building here, that's not negotiable." "I know," he said. "I need you to say more than I know," she said, "or I'm going to feel like I'm talking to a wall." Something moved in his face, the almost thing she'd seen before, the one he didn't usually let out. "Those are your things," he said. "I don't want them to be mine. I don't—" He stopped. Tried again, and she could tell this was difficult for him in a way that had nothing to do with unwillingness and everything to do with a man who had loved someone and lost her, and spent 3 years building walls that were structurally excellent and emotionally expensive. "I spent a long time not wanting anything," he said. "It was simpler. You can't lose what you don't want. I know how that sounds." "It sounds like something I understand," she said. "I want—" He stopped again. He looked at the fence line, then back at her. "I want to be around what you're building. I don't want to own it. I just—" A pause. "I want to see how it turns out." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's the most you've said to me at one time since I got here," she said. "Don't get used to it." "I might." He looked at her. She looked at him. There was nothing polished about either of them at that moment. Her half numb from the ride, him in fence-mending clothes with dirt on his hands, both of them standing in a yard between a barn and a house where too many things had been quiet for too long. "Have breakfast," he said. It wasn't an invitation exactly, more like a practical observation about the state of the morning. "I was hoping you'd say that," she said. "I rode 11 miles and I'm starving." The almost thing in his face became something more than almost, briefly. He reached past her and took the horse's reins and led it to the hitching post by the barn, and she followed, and they went inside. The courtship, she thought of it that way because it was the accurate word even if it sounded formal, was nothing like what had come before it. Victor had courted her with the precision of a campaign. Everything had been calibrated, the timing of the flowers, the choice of restaurant, the conversation topics selected to display himself to advantage. She'd found it romantic when she believed it was spontaneous. Looking back, she could see the machinery under it. What happened between her and Rourke that November had no visible machinery. It had awkward Saturday mornings when she stayed for breakfast and they talked, sometimes well, and sometimes not well, and once argued for 35 minutes about whether the Morrison building's east wall needed reinforcing before winter, and were both wrong and both too proud to say so until Arguello showed up and delivered the verdict that they each needed to add one more beam and they were each half right, which she considered a reasonable outcome. It had the afternoons when she brought her manuscript paper out to Iron Creek and worked on the piano in the parlor while Rourke did accounts at the desk in the next room, both of them occupied and in the same space without it requiring any justification. It had the evening in mid-November when he found her still at the piano at 8:30, working on the last measures of the third section, and stood in the doorway for a long time, and she didn't stop playing, and he didn't interrupt. And when she finally finished and turned around, he was still there, and his face had the open quality again, the one that cost him something. "Is it finished?" he asked. "That section is," she said. "There are two more." "How long?" "I don't know. It tells me when it's ready." He came into the room, sat in the fireside chair. He had a cup of coffee, had apparently gone to get one at some point and come back, and he held it with both hands and looked at the piano. "She would have liked you," he said. She knew he meant his mother. They had talked about her in pieces over the past weeks. A woman who'd played this piano in Missouri before the territory, who'd been fierce about music in a family that didn't quite understand what she needed from it, who died before she saw whether the territory would give her something or take everything. "I think I would have liked her," Eliza said. "She would have had opinions about you," he said. "She had opinions about everyone, strong ones. She would have approved of the school. She would have told me I should have spoken sooner." Eliza looked at him. "She would have been right about the last part." "Probably." He drank his coffee. "I'm not fast with things like this. I've noticed. It's not—" He set the cup down on the small table by the chair. "It's not absence of feeling, it's the opposite. It takes me a long time to let something matter because once it does—" He stopped. "Once it does?" she said. "It matters a lot," he said. "And losing it—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. She understood the shape of the sentence from the pale ring on his finger that had faded but not disappeared. She understood it in her own way, from a different angle, what it felt like to have cared about something and been wrong about it. The very specific way that made you careful afterward, careful to the point of not moving, careful until careful itself became a kind of loss. "I know," she said. They sat in the parlor of Iron Creek Ranch, with the lamp going low and the piano behind her, and the night outside doing what November nights in the territory did, which was to make the walls feel important, and she thought about two people who had each lost something and were sitting carefully in the same room. "Play something," he said. "Whatever you want." She turned to the piano. She played the first section of the piece she was still writing, the section she'd played the very first night, when she hadn't planned to, when it had come out of her because it had needed somewhere to go. She played it on an instrument that she'd tuned herself 3 weeks ago that still had 2 missing ivory covers and a wobbling bench, and she had not resolved either of those issues because she'd learned, somewhere between the cottage and the manuscript paper and the 31 days, that things didn't have to be perfect to be true. When she finished, Rourke said nothing for a while. Then, "That's the beginning." "Yes." "What's it about?" She considered giving him the careful answer, the aesthetic answer, the answer about thematic development and compositional structure. She didn't. "It's about the distance between where you are and where you're still going," she said, "and not knowing yet what that distance will look like when you've crossed it." He was quiet. "Does it have an ending?" he said. "Not yet," she said. "I'd like it to hear it," he said, "when you find it." She looked at him over her shoulder. "You'll hear it," she said. "What?" December came in cold and serious, the way Arizona December could surprise people who thought the territory was always blazing. The school kept running because Eliza opened it every morning regardless, and because 41 children had by now developed a habit of being there, and habits in children are more powerful than weather. She put a second stove in the building. Arguello built a flue for it. Cutter Briggs donated the iron. 3 other families donated wood. And the schoolroom was warm and close and smelled like chalk and pine, and the particular collective smell of many children in winter coats, which was a smell she had loved since her first teaching term, and loved still. Paloma's early morning sessions had expanded to 6 days a week, because Paloma had a capacity for work that outpaced any schedule Eliza put around it, and because, honestly, Eliza found the sessions more energizing than she'd expected. Teaching a child who was hungry for it in the specific way Paloma was hungry for it, not just dutiful, not just obedient, but genuinely pursuing something, was one of the things she hadn't been sure she'd find out here and had found. She was grading papers on a Tuesday evening, mid-December, when Rourke appeared at the cottage door with his best vest on. She noticed the vest before she noticed anything else. She'd seen him in work clothes and travel clothes, and once in a church shirt at a town meeting, but the vest was different, dark wool, well-maintained, the kind of garment worn selectively. He was also holding something. It took her a moment to identify it as a bunch of desert wildflowers, because wildflowers in December in the territory were not an obvious thing, and she had no idea where he'd found them or how long he'd been looking, but they were real and slightly wind-battered and very clearly brought with intention. She looked at the vest. She looked at the flowers. She looked at his face, which was doing the careful thing, the thing that meant he was about to say something that had cost him something to prepare. "Rourke," she said. "I know you're grading," he said. "I can stop grading." "I don't want to interrupt. Rourke." She put the papers down. "Come inside." He came inside. She took the flowers, which were in fact quite lovely despite their wind damage, and put them in the jar she used for the purpose on the windowsill, and she turned around and he was standing in the middle of her small cottage with his hat in one hand and the vest and the look on his face. "I have something to ask you," he said. "I know," she said. "You know." "You're wearing your best vest and you brought wildflowers in December," she said. "I've been teaching children to pay attention for years. I pay attention." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "And?" She looked at him. She thought about the woman who had arrived in this town with $4.60 and a sprained ankle and no plan. She thought about the school with 41 students and Arguello's shelves and the second stove, and Harlan explaining subtraction to a 7-year-old. She thought about the manuscript paper in the third section and the question about whether it had to be right or just had to be honest. She thought about 11 miles on a horse she was still negotiating. She thought about this man crossing a street when no one else would. "Ask me," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. He said it as a statement almost as much as a question, which was exactly like him, and she found she didn't mind that. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. Just one breath, just slightly more than the usual quantity, and she understood that he'd been more uncertain than he'd shown, which was also exactly like him. "Yes," she said again, because it bore repeating. "Not because I need somewhere to belong. I have somewhere. I built it." "I know," he said. "But because I want to share it with you," she said. "That's different." "I know that too," he said. She crossed the cottage and she stood in front of him, and he put the hand that wasn't holding his hat on her face carefully, the way he did everything useful. Not elaborate, not performing it, just doing it. And for a moment they stood in the small lamp-lit space of the cottage she'd made hers. In December, in Arizona Territory, in 1878, and neither of them said anything else. There wasn't anything else to say. The school would open in the morning. The piano at Iron Creek needed its last 2 sections. Paloma was coming at 5:30 on Wednesday. Cutter Briggs's son could do long division and had recently discovered, to his own surprise, that he liked poetry and wasn't about to tell anyone. All of it was real. All of it was hers, and now shared, and still hers. She thought about the woman in the dust of the main street. She thought, look at the distance. And standing in the middle of it, she thought she understood. Finally, without having to explain it to herself, what the last section of the piece was supposed to sound like. They were married in February, on a Saturday, which was the only day Eliza would agree to because the school ran Monday through Friday, and she wasn't closing it for a wedding, not even her own. Rourke had not argued with this. He'd said Saturday was fine. She'd had the impression he would have said any day was fine, which was both touching and slightly maddening because she'd prepared a small argument in favor of Saturday and hadn't gotten to use it. The ceremony was at the Morrison Building, her school, because she didn't want it at Harkins and the settlement's church still didn't have a regular minister, and Justice Alderman from the territorial court happened to be passing through Copper Hollow on his quarterly circuit and was willing to perform a civil ceremony for the price of a good meal, which Mrs. Harlowe provided without being asked. It was not a large wedding. Eliza had not wanted a large wedding, having been in the process of planning one once before and having strong feelings about how that had concluded. What she wanted was the people she actually knew, in a room that actually meant something, with an honest exchange of words and then a meal and then back to living. That was what she got. Arguello came with his wife and all three daughters, Paloma standing straight in the front row with the specific composure of an 11-year-old who considers herself significantly older. Thomas Briggs came with his father, and Cutter Briggs stood in the back with his arms crossed and his waxed mustache, and an expression that was not warm exactly, but was, she decided, genuine. Mrs. Harlowe and Ben. Doc Aldridge, who had brought a bottle of something that smelled expensive and which he shared with no one until after the ceremony. Denny, who had washed his ears for the occasion and stood beside Rourke with the solemnity of someone taking a very important examination. And the children. 22 of her students who came because their families came, ranging from Thomas Briggs doing his careful mathematical assessment of the room to the smallest. A 6-year-old named Clara, who had recovered from her early habit of crying twice and then sleeping, and who pressed herself against Eliza's skirt before the ceremony and said with complete seriousness, "Are you still going to be our teacher?" "Yes," Eliza said. "I'm still going to be your teacher." "Because you're getting married. People can be teachers and married at the same time. Those are not exclusive conditions." Clara considered this. "My mother is married." "And what does your mother do?" "Everything," Clara said. "There you are," Eliza said. Clara appeared satisfied and went back to her family. Rourke was waiting at the front of the room beside Justice Alderman when Eliza walked up the center aisle, which was simply the cleared space between 2 rows of chairs that Arguello had arranged, and which was not in any technical sense an aisle. He was wearing the vest again, and a good shirt, and his hat was off and in Denny's keeping. He watched her come down the row of chairs with the specific quality of attention she'd become accustomed to. The kind that didn't perform itself, that just was. And when she reached him, she looked at his face and thought, as she had a number of times in the past 2 months, that she'd been correct. It was not the face she'd first seen when he'd been measuring the situation. It was the face underneath that one, the one it had taken time to find. Justice Alderman was brief and practical, which she appreciated. The words they exchanged were simple. She had written what she wanted to say, not elaborate but honest. And when she said them to Rourke directly, not to the room. He said his to her the same way. Afterward, when the room had rearranged itself into something more like a meal than a ceremony, Denny appeared at her elbow with a glass of something and said, quietly and earnestly, "He's been different since you came, just so you know. Easier." She looked at him. "Easier how?" Denny thought about it with his whole face, as was his habit. "Like he's not carrying everything alone," he said. "He still carries a lot, but not alone." She looked across the room at Rourke, who was talking to Arguello about something structural. She could tell from the gestures, both men looking at the ceiling beams in the way of people who cannot resist assessing a building. And she thought about a man who had built walls that were structurally excellent and emotionally expensive, and had, over the course of one difficult autumn and one cold winter, started letting someone through them. Not thrown the walls down, not pretended they weren't there, just quietly opened a door. "Thank you, Denny," she said. He went red to the ears and went to find more food. The first year of this marriage was not simple. She had not expected it to be simple. She had a knowledge of herself by now that was fairly clear-eyed. She was stubborn. She was opinionated about her work to a degree that occasionally prevented other people from being helpful. And she had a habit of solving problems entirely on her own before asking for assistance that Rourke found both admirable and profoundly frustrating, which she understood because she found the same quality in him profoundly frustrating when she was on the receiving end of it. They were alike in more ways than either of them had initially recognized, which was both the source of what worked between them and the source of what occasionally didn't. There was the argument in March about the school's finances. The Territorial Education Board had sent a quarterly allocation that was smaller than projected, and Eliza had spent 3 weeks quietly rearranging her budget before Rourke noticed the manuscript paper had been replaced on the parlor desk. She'd moved back to Iron Creek after the wedding, commuting to town on the borrowed Arguello horse, which had become her horse in all practical senses, by a ledger she was frowning at. "Show me," he said. "I'm managing it," she said. "Show me anyway." "Rourke, Eliza." He sat down across from her, not demanding, just sitting. "Show me." She showed him. He looked at the numbers for a while without speaking, which was his way. "The allocation is short by 30%, he said. "I know that. If we pull forward the supply order to next quarter and defer the—" "I've already done that," she said. Look at column 3. He looked at column 3. He was quiet for a moment. You've also been subsidizing 2 families' supply costs yourself, he said. It wasn't a question. She had been hoping he wouldn't notice that. She had categorized it subtly, but not subtly enough for a man who had been reconciling ranch ledgers for 15 years. The Delgado children need slates, she said. Their father had a bad season. I know about the Delgado season, he said. I know Hector Delgado. If you'd told me, it wasn't your problem to fix, she said, and heard as she said it, how it sounded. She stopped. Tried again. I'm accustomed to fixing things myself. I know, he said. It's not distrust. It's habit, he said. I know that too. He looked at the ledger. You don't have to ask my permission for how you run the school, but if you need resources, I have resources. That's not, he paused. That's not me taking anything from you. It's just what's available. She looked at him. She had thought about this. About the line between sharing resources and surrendering independence. About where that line ran and how you knew when you'd crossed it. Victor had used money as a mechanism of control so consistently that the subject of finances had developed, for her, a specific wariness she had to consciously override. Rourke was not Victor. She knew this with the clarity that had only gotten clearer in the months since she'd named it on her cottage porch. But knowing it and acting from it were different muscular actions, and she was still building the muscle. Hector Delgado needs slates for his children, she said. That's the fact of it. All right, Rourke said. I'll talk to Hector. He can do some fence work in spring. That way it's not charity, which Hector won't accept, and his children have slates. Eliza looked at him. That's better than what I did, she said. It's different, he said. Not necessarily better. It preserves his dignity. You preserved his children's education. Both things matter. She thought about that for a while. I'll tell you next time, she said, when there's a resource problem. That's all I'm asking, he said. He handed her back the ledger. She went back to column 3. He went back to whatever he'd been doing before he'd noticed the ledger, which was mending a piece of harness on the other side of the desk, and they sat in the same room doing separate things in companionable friction, which was, she was learning, the actual texture of a life built with someone. Not the smooth surface, the actual texture. The drought came in the second year. It announced itself gradually, the way droughts did. Not a single rainless day, but a slow accumulation of them. A January that had been dry, and a February drier, and a March that produced 3 small rains that were not enough. By April, the creek at Iron Creek was running low enough that Rourke was making decisions about water allocation that she could see costing him something each time. The smaller homesteads felt it first. There were 7 homesteading families within 15 miles of Copper Hollow. People who'd come west on the promise of land and were working it with the specific stubbornness of people who have no alternative plan. 2 of them had children in the school. All of them were in trouble by May, when the creek dropped another foot and the well at the Marsh family's homestead went dry. Eliza found out about the marsh well from their daughter, Rose, who was 8, and who mentioned it in the way children mentioned serious things, sideways, while doing something else, not looking at the person she was telling. Papa said not to say anything, Rose said, very carefully erasing a wrong letter from her slate. Then I won't tell him you mentioned it, Eliza said, equally carefully. She went to Rourke that evening. He already knew about the marsh well. He knew about 3 other situations she hadn't known about. He had, she discovered, been spending the previous 2 weeks quietly doing arithmetic about water, the creek, the secondary wells on Iron Creek's property, the aquifer depth, the rough mathematics of how many families could share access to what remained. You didn't tell me, she said. I was working it out first, he said. She recognized this. She lived with it in herself. We're the same person, she said. We are not the same person, he said. We have the same flaw. He was quiet for a moment. We're both trying to protect each other from problems. Yes. That's not, no, she agreed. It's not. They looked at each other. What have you worked out so far, she said. He showed her. It was thorough and it was good. Access agreements he'd been drafting, a proposed schedule for shared well use, a plan for getting water from Iron Creek's secondary source to the 2 driest homesteads. What it lacked was the social architecture. He knew the water. He didn't always know how to approach people in a way that let them accept help without feeling like they were accepting defeat. She was better at that. She'd learned it teaching, and then teaching the parents of students, and then teaching a whole town to think of the school as theirs. "Let me talk to the families," she said. "I'll frame it as a community arrangement, not charity. Shared infrastructure. Everyone contributes what they have." "And what do the families without water contribute?" he said. "They contribute their children's attendance," she said. "They contribute Hector Delgado's fence work. They contribute whatever they have that isn't water, and we don't make a ledger of the exchange." Rourke looked at her. "That'll work with some of them," he said. "Briggs and Arguello will be easier. The Marsh family. Tom Marsh is proud," she said. "I know. His daughter has his jaw. I'll talk to him myself." "He doesn't know you that well." "He knows my school," she said. "He trusts my school. I'll start there." Rourke sat back in his chair. He looked at the water plan spread on the desk between them, his side and her additions beginning to fill in the margins. "We're better at this together," he said. It was not a romantic statement. It was said the way he said factual things, plainly, with the weight of a real observation. "Yes," she said. "We are." The drought lasted through August. It was hard, and it cost things. Not catastrophically, not the way droughts in the territory sometimes cost everything, but enough. One family lost a third of their livestock. 2 homesteads came close to failing before the water-sharing arrangements Eliza and Rourke had organized with the other ranchers kept them solvent. There were arguments because shared resources always produced arguments. Who was using more than their share? Whose cattle were encroaching on whose water access? The specific resentments that scarcity generated between people who'd been neighborly when there was enough. Eliza went to 2 of those arguments, not as Rourke's wife, as herself, as the teacher whose school the children of both arguing parties attended, as the person who had organized the original agreement, as someone with standing she'd built independently and was now choosing to use. She didn't resolve both arguments. She resolved one and managed the other down to a productive tension that didn't break into something worse, which she counted as a success. What surprised her was Cutter Briggs. He came to her in July, at the school. The school was running a shortened summer session because several families needed the older children home for work, but Eliza refused to let the younger ones lose 3 months of progress. And he stood in the doorway the way he always stood in doorways, arms crossed, chin slightly elevated, a man performing his own authority. "The marsh well is still dry," he said. "I know," she said. "My east well has good water, more than my cattle need." She looked at him. "The Marsh family would benefit from access," she said carefully. "I know that," he said. "I'm not stupid. I'm saying I have water. They need water. Someone should probably arrange that." He looked at the ceiling. "I don't know Tom Marsh well enough for him to accept it coming from me directly. He'd think it was charity. And if it came from a general arrangement, several ranchers contributing to shared access?" Cutter's mustache moved. "That'd be different." "I can make that arrangement," she said. "I know you can," he said. He looked at her. "That's why I came here." She looked at him for a moment. This man who'd stood at the bottom of her porch steps and told her he wouldn't send his son to a school run by a woman who'd gotten thrown off a stagecoach, who had sent his son anyway, whose son could now do long division and had, in June, written a poem about a horse that was by any measure a genuinely good poem. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs," she said. He looked uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Tom Marsh's youngest is in your school," he said, as if he needed a practical reason on record. "She is," Eliza said. "Rose. She's very bright." "Then it's practical," he said. He uncrossed his arms. "Not charity." "Not charity," she agreed. He left. Eliza stood in the empty schoolroom and thought about a man who needed a reason other than kindness to do a kind thing, and whether the kindness was less real for the packaging, and decided it wasn't. It was the thing he had, and it was offered genuinely, and the Marsh family would have water. That was what mattered. The piece was finished in September, at the end of the drought, when the creek at Iron Creek came back, and the air changed and the territory remembered that it knew how to be something other than merciless. She finished it at the ranch, at the old piano, on a Sunday evening when Rourke was in the next room and the house was quiet, except for the sound of the last flies of summer against the window, and the distant early evening sound of the territory settling into itself. The last section had taken 9 months to write. Not because she didn't know what she wanted, but because the material kept changing as the year changed her, kept requiring her to revise what she thought the piece was about, kept insisting it wasn't finished yet. It was, she had decided, the most honest thing she'd ever written, which meant it was also the most difficult. When she played the final measures, the return to the opening theme that was altered now, that carried the weight of everything between the beginning and the end, that was not resolved in the way she'd originally planned, but was resolved in the way she'd learned was true, which was imperfectly and honestly and with something still open at the edges. She sat for a moment in the quiet after it. Then she said, "It's done." Rourke appeared in the doorway. She played it through from the beginning, all of it. 35 minutes on an out-of-tune piano with 2 missing ivory covers and a bench that wobbled, and she played it without stopping, without correcting herself when she hit a wrong note, without performing it for him or for herself, just the piece, the whole distance of it. When she finished, neither of them said anything for a while. "That's different from the beginning," Rourke said finally. "It's the same theme," she said, "but it's been through things." "Yeah," he said. He was quiet. "It sounds like something that actually happened." She looked at him over her shoulder. "It is something that actually happened," she said. "It just happened in music instead of out loud." He came into the room, sat in the fireside chair. He looked at her with the face she'd learned to read over a year of marriage, with all the things he still carried in it, his wife, his son, the years of surviving alone, the walls that were still there but weren't sealed anymore. And she thought about how wrong it was that anyone believed love required you to become uncomplicated. The most real love she'd ever witnessed was in the faces of people who had been complicated by their lives and were still choosing to show up. "What are you going to do with it?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "It exists now. That's something on its own." "You should do something with it," he said. "Like what? Send it to a publisher in San Francisco who will file it under things we don't need from women in territories?" "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe they'll see what it is." "And what is it?" He thought about this with the care he brought to things that mattered. "It's a piece by someone who knows something," he said. "That's different from most music I've heard." She turned on the bench and looked at him fully. "When have you heard music?" "Before you, not often," he said. "After you, frequently." She laughed. She didn't do it often enough, she thought. Full, genuine laughing. And when she did, it surprised her a little each time, which was probably a thing worth noting. "I'll think about the publisher," she said. She didn't think about it long. What she thought about, in the days after, was the school. Because the school was about to become something bigger than it already was, and that required more of her attention than her own compositions, at least for now. Well, the railroad came to Copper Hollow in the spring of the 3rd year, and everything changed, not all at once, not cleanly. The change that a railroad brings to a small settlement is not orderly. It's more like dropping a large stone into still water and watching the rings spread out in every direction, some of them improving things, and some of them disturbing things that had been still for good reasons. The population of Copper Hollow doubled in 8 months. New families arrived, new businesses, 2 new saloons, which Eliza found she had complicated feelings about, being in principle not opposed to adults making their own choices, and in practice concerned about what 2 new saloons in a growing town did to the school-aged children of the men who used them. She had opinions about this and expressed them at the town council meeting in July with the directness she'd developed over 3 years of running a school in a place where directness was more useful than diplomacy. The town council was 5 men. 3 of them had children in her school. She made her case for a larger school building. The current Morrison building was full. 41 students had become 63, with more arriving as families settled, and she was running 2 full sessions a day plus Paloma's early morning advanced work. And the room was at a physical capacity that was starting to affect learning because you could not think clearly when someone's elbow was in your ribs. She needed more space. She needed another teacher. She needed the council to commit resources. Cutter Briggs was on the town council. She had not known this until she arrived at the meeting. He voted in favor of her proposal before the other 4 had finished considering it. "The school is what makes this a town worth coming to," he said, in the flat tone of someone making a practical statement. "Without it, we're just a railroad stop. We're better than that." She looked at him across the council table. He didn't acknowledge her look. He was looking at the other 4 members with the expression of a man who had registered his opinion and considered the matter settled, which, with Cutter Briggs, it generally was. The larger school building was approved in August and broke ground in September. Arguello built the bookshelves again. He brought his daughters to help carry lumber, and Paloma, who was 13 now and 4 inches taller and working through algebra textbooks. Eliza had ordered from San Francisco, organized the younger students into a supply chain for the construction days, which was an exercise in logistics that Eliza filed away as evidence that Paloma was going to do something remarkable with her life. She didn't know what. She thought Paloma might not know yet either, but the capacity was visible in everything she did, the way good timber shows its grain. You should apply to the Territorial Normal School, Eliza told her in October, on a Friday morning before the other students arrived. In 2 years, when you're 15, they take girls. Paloma looked at her. Is that what you think I should do? She said. I think it's one of several things you could do, Eliza said. I think you should know it exists and that you qualify. Did you go to normal school? Boston Normal, yes. And then you came here. Eventually, Eliza said. Paloma was quiet for a moment. She was working through a problem set, and her pencil was still moving while she thought, which was something Eliza had noticed early and never stopped finding interesting. If I go to normal school and come back, Paloma said, would there be a place for me here? As a teacher? Eliza looked at her. She thought about a girl 11 years old pressing herself against a doorframe asking to learn more than what school was teaching. She thought about 30 months of 5:30 mornings, of algebra giving way to geometry, giving way to the early edges of calculus, of literature from Boston to London, to the great Spanish writers Eliza had tracked down through a correspondence with a bookseller in Tucson. Yes, she said, there would be a place for you. Paloma went back to her problem set. Eliza went to the chalkboard. They worked in silence in the early October light, teacher and student, and Eliza thought about what it meant to plant something you wouldn't fully see the harvest of. Her students would leave. The best ones always did. They'd go further than Copper Hollow, build things in other places, take what she'd given them and add to it and give it to someone else. And the things she'd started would travel in ways she couldn't follow. That was the point. That had always been the point. The letter arrived in November. She recognized the San Francisco postmark before she read the address, and she thought immediately of the composition. Though she had not sent it to San Francisco, had thought about it and decided it wasn't ready and set it aside. It was from a publisher. Rourke had sent it, without telling her. He had made a clean copy of her manuscript. She had no idea when. She had no idea how he'd learned enough of her notation to make a clean copy. She had a suspicion Paloma had helped, though she would never confirm this, and sent it to a publisher in San Francisco with a letter, which she also found enclosed, which was 2 paragraphs long and described the composition in plain, straightforward language as the work of a serious musician who had built a school in a frontier territory and written this music while doing it. No flourishes, no salesmanship, just the facts, as Rourke understood them. She stood at the kitchen table at Iron Creek and read the letter twice. Then she sat down. Rourke was in the East Pasture. She knew this. He would not be back until noon. She had approximately 2 hours to have whatever reaction she was going to have privately, which was, she thought, something he had probably calculated. She read the publisher's letter. They wanted to publish 3 of the 5 sections as a set for solo piano. They had questions about the remaining 2 sections and whether they were to be included. They considered the work, as quoted in the letter, of genuine musical interest and suitable for an educated general audience. They wanted a response within 60 days. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She thought about sitting in a concert hall in Boston while her professor played a piece by a woman composer who had published under a man's name because there was no other way. She thought about the years she'd spent giving other people's music to other people's children while the music she wanted to write lived only in her head. She thought about 2 years of being made small enough to fit into the space Victor Dane had decided she deserved. She thought about the wobbling piano bench and the missing ivory keys and the drought and the school and the 31 days and Paloma's pencil still moving while she thought. She picked up the publisher's letter, folded it, and put it in the front of her teaching ledger, where she put things that required her considered attention. When Rourke came back at noon, she was at the stove making something. He came in, poured water, drank half, looked at her back. "You got the letter," he said. "Yes." "And?" She turned around. "You made a clean copy of my manuscript," she said. "I did." "You sent it without asking me." He looked at her steadily. Yes. That was, Rourke, that was my work. That was a decision that was mine to make. I know, he said. He did not apologize, which she'd been braced for, and which would have been less useful than what he actually said. I also know you'd been going back and forth on it for 6 months, and talked yourself out of it 3 times, and the reasons you gave yourself each time weren't good enough reasons. She looked at him. They weren't, he said. I'm not telling you whether to accept. I'm not telling you what to do with it. I just thought you should have the real choice instead of the one you were making in your head. She held his gaze. This was the thing about him that still caught her sometimes. The way he saw her clearly without needing to manage what he saw. Not the version she presented, not the easy one, but the actual architecture. He'd seen it from the beginning, from the moment he'd asked, "Can you stand?" instead of "Are you okay?" And he'd kept seeing it through everything. And he didn't always say it, but he acted from it. And sometimes acting from it meant doing something she hadn't given him permission for because he could see, more clearly than she could from inside it, that she needed the door opened. It's 3 sections, she said finally. They want to discuss the other 2. Are the other 2 ready? I think so. Then tell them so. She set down what she'd been holding and walked across the kitchen and put her arms around him, which she did with less ceremony and more frequency than she would once have predicted. And he put his hands on her back, and she stood there for a moment thinking about the distance between where she'd been and where she was. Thank you, she said. The letter was Paloma's idea, he said. She laughed into his shoulder. Of course it was, she said. Well, the performance was in April at the new school. Not San Francisco. The San Francisco premiere was months away, a separate thing, a formal thing with a program and an audience she didn't know. This was different. This was Eliza standing in the larger schoolroom with its new bookshelves and its 3 times as much floor space, with 63 students in rows and their parents standing along the walls, and 4 of her oldest students playing 2 sections of the composition she'd been writing since before she arrived in this territory. Paloma on the harmony line, Harlan, who had gone from difficult 14-year-old to a 16-year-old with genuine musical aptitude he'd been quietly developing for a year, on the primary. 2 others she'd taught in the last 2 years, both earnest and imperfect, and doing something real. She stood at the back. She had not planned to stand at the back. She'd meant to stand to the side where she could hear properly. But when the room filled up and she saw who had come, not just her students and their parents, but the Briggs family and the Arguello family, and Doc Aldridge with his large white mustache and his expensive bottle, and Mrs. Harlowe and Ben and Denny, and half the new families who'd arrived with the railroad, and some of whom had children in the school now, and some of whom had just heard there was something happening worth attending. When she saw all of that, she moved to the back. Rourke was already there. He was standing against the back wall with their daughter, who was a year old and was currently more interested in the buttons on her father's vest than in the music, but was, Eliza thought, possibly absorbing something. And their son, 4 months yet, she was beginning to show, nobody but Rourke and Doc Aldridge knew yet, was, she thought, probably also absorbing something. She stood next to Rourke. He looked at her. She looked at the room. The music started. It was imperfect. Paloma hit 3 wrong notes in the first section, which she always did under pressure, because she practiced too quickly and the nervous system compressed the fast passages. Harlan lost the tempo once in the middle section and recovered it, and there was a brief moment where the 2 parts were slightly misaligned that made Eliza's ear catch and hold, and then release when they found each other again. It was imperfect, and it was real, and it was hers, in a room she had built, played by children she had taught, in a town she had helped make into something. She felt Rourke's hand find hers in the space between them. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the room, on Paloma's focused face, on the wall of parents and ranchers and railroad men and families who had gotten here by such different roads. On Thomas Briggs, who was 15 now, and tall, and who had recently written an essay about water rights in the territory that she'd made him read to the whole school because it was the clearest piece of thinking she'd received from a student in 3 years. On Clara, who had stopped crying twice and falling asleep, and now sat in the 3rd row with the composed attention of a 7-year-old who had decided she liked music. On Cutter Briggs, at the far wall, who was not crying, absolutely not, but who was looking at the students with an expression she could only describe as having given something up that he hadn't known he was holding on to. The music reached the third section, the transition she'd fought for months, the one that was uncertain and a little rough and didn't resolve the way she'd intended, the one that was honest rather than right. She heard it and thought, yes, that's the one. That's the true part. She thought about the woman in the dust of this town's main street. She thought about a trunk split open, sheet music scattering. She thought about the boy who'd collected it. She'd never found out who it was. She'd asked 3 separate times over 3 years, and nobody admitted to it. And she'd come to think of it as one of those things that happened in the world without attribution, one of those acts of basic human decency that didn't require a name to be real. She thought about what it had cost her to stand up. Not the ankle. The ankle was the minor version of the cost. The real cost was the thing that Victor Dane had been working on for 2 years before she'd arrived in Copper Hollow, the slow, patient erosion of a person's belief in their own judgment. That was the real injury. The rest was dust and money and a sprained joint. The belief was what took longer. It took a school with 41 students who became 63. It took a ledger balanced by her own hand and a drought managed by shared water and a town council vote and a publisher in San Francisco and 13 months of 5:30 mornings with a girl who wanted more room for the things in her head. It took a man who crossed a street when no one else would and who asked, "Can you stand?" instead of "Are you okay?" and who made a clean copy of her manuscript and sent it without asking because he could see from outside what she couldn't see from inside, that she had something worth offering the world and she was talking herself out of offering it, and the door needed to be opened. The music finished. For a moment the room was very quiet. Then it wasn't. She did not think of what followed as an ovation. It was a small frontier town in 1882, not a concert hall in Boston, and what happened was that 63 children and their families and Doc Aldridge and Cutter Briggs and Ben Harlow and Denny and the new families off the railroad all made noise at the same time, with the specific quality of people who had not been told how to respond and were responding from the place below the instructions. Paloma turned from the keys and looked at Eliza across the room. Eliza looked back at her. There was a conversation in that look that required no words and that she thought about for years afterward. The teacher who had come here with nothing, and the student who had come here with everything she needed but no room to use it, both of them standing in the school they'd built together, on opposite ends of the distance between beginning and becoming. Rourke's hand was still in hers. She turned to look at him and found him already looking at her, the face she knew now, the open one, the one that had taken time to find. "The ending," he said quietly, under the noise of the room. "Yes," she said. "It was honest." "It was," she said. She looked at the room. She looked at the shelves Argelo had built, and the windows that let in the long spring light, and the chalkboard she wrote on every morning in her clear, clean script, and the students who were now talking to their parents with the specific animation of children who have experienced something and need to tell someone what it felt like. She looked at the distance. She had not come west looking for a man to save her. She had come west running from a man who had tried to destroy her, and she had landed in the dirt of a frontier street with $4.60 and a sprained ankle, and she had stood up. Everything after that she had built. The school, the music, the early morning sessions, and the water arrangements, and the town council meetings, and the arguments about ledgers, and the 31 days, and the wobbling piano bench, and the present moment, all of it was hers because she had found the courage to stand up in the first place and had refused, every day and every way that mattered, to go back down. Rourke had lifted her from the dirt once. That was the beginning. The rest was what you did with the beginning. Outside, the April light was long across the territory, the kind of light that made the distance look possible. Copper Hollow was a real town now, growing outward from its center the way real things grew. Not smoothly, not by plan, but with the particular vitality of something that had found its conditions and decided to live in them. She had been one of those conditions. She had not expected that. She had not come here knowing what she would build. She'd come here because a man had thrown her out of a stagecoach, and the stagecoach had kept going, and she had lain in the dust of this street and seen a whole town watching from its porches and understood that the West didn't care about you. She revised that again, finally, for the last time. The West was the same as everywhere else. Most people watched from porches. Some people crossed the street. What made the difference was not the place, but the people in it who chose to move. She had crossed her own street every single day. That was what the music was about. That was what all of it had been about. The room was still full of noise. Her daughter had fallen asleep against Rourke's chest, entirely unbothered by the noise, which was a quality she'd exhibited since birth, and which Eliza found both amusing and aspirational. Paloma was being told something by her father, who was gesturing with the large, capable hands of a man who built things, and was proud of a daughter who built different things. Thomas Briggs was talking to Harlan with the focused interest of two young people who had once occupied opposite poles of a classroom and had ended up, improbably, with genuine respect for each other. Eliza stood at the back of the room. She had built this. Not alone. Never alone. That was the lesson she'd had to learn twice. The one about accepting help without losing yourself. The one about the difference between dependence and partnership. The one that took a drought and a ledger and a man with wildflowers in December to teach her properly. But she had built it, hers completely, freely chosen and freely given. She thought that was enough for one life. Then she thought, no, it's a beginning, and she was not afraid of beginnings anymore.